Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah, and welcome to a third session actually of Islamic Conversations. So this is part of a series where I come together with someone whose work I find very interesting, and have a conversation with them on something which is of mutual interest. And it gives me great pleasure this week to welcome Ismail Royer from across the Atlantic at the Religious Freedom Institute. He's currently the director of Islam and Religious Freedom Action, the Islam and Religious Freedom Action Team at RFI, and has been sort of working at RFI for quite a few years at this point. Has a very fascinating and colourful history, which we can talk about if you're interested, Sidi Ismail, and
Sure.
has been very prolific in publishing in various outlets. From the Washington Post to sort of religious journals like First Things, Public Discourse, Muslim Matters, and the like. And so it's with great pleasure that I actually welcome Ismail to continue a conversation that we started on his channel at Islam RFI. If you go on Twitter, you'll be able to find that handle Twitter handle at Islam RFI, and that basically is the work that Ismail is up to. And we had actually something like a 2-hour conversation on my recently published book. So this is a bit of a selfish sort of, I ask people to forgive the self-aggrandizement that is entailed in this further session, as though 2 hours is not enough to have a discussion on my book. But I'd like to suggest that it is the topic that really deserves our attention, and I'm very grateful that Brother Ismail is someone who's willing to engage me in this. The format, because it's a discussion of my own book, the format's a little unusual, and if it's all right with yourself, Sidi Ismail, I'll briefly give a very broad overview of my book for people who are completely unfamiliar. If you want that overview, I have a number of videos on my channel where I discuss my book, so to differing degrees of detail. And inshallah, I hope to upload sort of my conversation with Ismail that took place a few weeks ago now, about 3 weeks ago, on his channel. I hope to upload that on my own channel, although I apologize in advance. I had some video issues there, so I was very freezing every few seconds. So without further ado, if it's all right with yourself, Brother Ismail, I can give you the floor if you'd like to actually add anything before I launch into a brief description of my book.
No, please go ahead. Go ahead with the book, inshallah.
Jazakallah khair.
Well, yeah.
And thank you very much for your time as well in this regard.
Likewise.
Barakallahu fikum. So this is my sort of book, Islam and the Arab Revolutions, the ulama between democracy and autocracy. Hopefully you can see that nice and clearly. I had alhamdulillah, the wonderful news that it's going to be coming out in paperback. So friends who've been patiently awaiting that is on its way, because unfortunately, these hardback books are very expensive, and I'm sure a little to the chagrin of my publisher, I must I feel obliged to point out to friends and colleagues at universities in particular that this will be on Oxford Scholarship Online within a few months' time. So you'll be able to read the PDF through your university network for free. And hopefully, my publisher will get something from that as well. I'm pretty sure it works that way, right? This is a book about basically how the ulama engaged with the revolutions of 2011 onwards. It technically started in December 2010 in Tunisia. And so, this is something which is in some sense an ongoing and unfolding event in the Middle East, where people started uprisings against these dictators, rulers for life. And in that process, they basically sort of were engaged also by ulama, and a number of ulama came out. For those unfamiliar with that term, I suspect most of my viewers will be familiar with that term, but basically the typical sort of English translation is religious cleric of some kind, and I find it a little bit of an unusual term. I like to use indigenous terms, but the ulama I'm speaking of basically divide, broadly speaking, into two camps: those who are for the revolutions and those who are against. and I look at five main figures, I would say, and then around five sort of somewhat less, in less detail, look at five other figures. This is a selection which isn't entirely arbitrary. I'm trying to signify or trying to highlight the thought in a very thickly described, richly textured way of scholars who are trying to argue for or against the Arab revolutions. And I thought that in order to really explore that thought systematically, I needed to dig into a handful of scholars rather than just do a kind of scattergun approach. And Brother Ismail very kindly agreed with me that that was a good approach to the text when we had our conversation last time. Broadly speaking, these will be familiar names to people who are interested in ulama studies or people who are interested in the ulama in the Middle East. On my cover, I've got in the center Yusuf Khaladawi, who's kind of like one of the central characters in my text, although he starts off the discussion in chapters 1 and 2. The central sort of alim who is, I think, a highly problematic figure is this chap, Ali Gum'a. As would come out of the writing here, I'm somewhat partial to the view of someone like Qaradawi and somewhat, well, actually quite clearly sort of critical of the views of Ali Gum'a, even though this isn't really a normative book. I'm not sort of like, I don't go out of my way to talk about why Qaradawi is good and why Ali Gum'a is bad. I'm just saying that, Ali Gum'a's perspectives, unfortunately, are characterized by justifying the Egyptian military's behavior no matter what it does. And so, including the perpetration of mass murder in Egypt. So that's something which I problematize. And a lot of people in Muslim sort of contexts are unfamiliar with this. And I actually think that part of my sort of writing this book is about informing people about something, which is that, religious knowledge isn't automatically a guide to, the right sort of action. And this is something which modern Muslims need to spend a lot of time grappling with, because there are also, and this is something I don't want to do, many people who seek to discredit religious people and religious knowledge in particular. And I don't want to be part of that sort of secular trend. Secular trends mean something very different in economics. I'm talking about this in religious terms. That sort of secular trend to try and discredit religiousness or religiosity or religious knowledge as an important source of our normative guidance and so on. So overall, I'm basically looking at, okay, how do these two sets of scholars argue for democratic revolution, against democratic revolution, and to a certain extent, what does Islam have to say about these sorts of questions? I don't really explore that very systematically as a question. I really do it through the perspectives of various players here. So I hope, inshallah, that gives a very broad summary. Towards the end of the book, I actually also explore briefly the question of, can the sort of behavior of some of these scholars who justified the military coup in Egypt in 2013, it was a very bloody crackdown, what Human Rights Watch at the time called the largest sort of mass killings in recent history in a place like Egypt. Can that be justified with reference to the Islamic scholarly tradition, which some Western academics, very often Muslim Western academics, had sort of argued for. So, and I kind of take a position on that. We can discuss that if and when it comes up, inshallah. But with that, I hope I've given people a reasonable sense of what the book is about, and I will stop talking at this point. Ismail, because your wind was blowing, I actually muted your mic, so you'll have to unmute if that's all right. You have this very beautiful background. You're in daylight in North America. For us, it's of course evening here in the UK. But as a consequence of being outdoors, of course, there's sometimes a little bit of sort of noise. Okay, you might need to Okay, actually, I can unmute you, it seems. Okay, there we are.
There you go. There you go.
Okay, perfect.
Okay.
I didn't realize I had
Yeah.
that much control over the situation, but there you go.
All right. I first of all, I have many preliminaries here. First, let me
Sure,
say
absolutely.
thank you so much for having me on. I mean, we've had so
It's my
many
pleasure.
we've had so many really stimulating discussions, whether they took place on Twitter or WhatsApp or and then we finally
Right.
got to we on the phone. I think we talked, and then we got
Yep,
to talk.
yep.
Then we got to talk on YouTube a few weeks ago, as you said, also on StreamYard, and now here we are again. So inshallah, one day be able to meet in person, inshallah.
Inshallah.
The second preliminary I want to say, well, first of all, assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah to you and to everyone who is watching.
Wa alaikum assalam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh.
And Bismillah ar-Rahman ar-Rahim. Also want to say that I'm in a somewhat odd situation. I'm outside a cafe, and so I just want to ask everyone's indulgence, because there's going to be some wind blowing.
No problem at all.
Bright sun, and hopefully no power issues or anything come up. But anyway,
inshallah.
Inshallah. I just wanted to say thank you for that introduction of your book, and I thought that perhaps viewers might want to know a lot, like, why is it interesting to talk to me about your book? And I think like, who am I, and what is it about? And what is it about, like, me that makes me an interesting person to discuss your book with? And I think what I would first of all, I think that it's worth pointing out, and this is not just obviously nothing to do with like inflating my own, who I am or anything like that, but just to say that I think that you and I have a very we're interesting counterparts in a way, because we have different ways of looking at these issues, but at the same time, there's a lot of common ground. And so one of the really interesting things, for us is to, in those areas of disagreement and trying to discover what those areas of common ground are, a lot of, I think, I'm being forced to ask myself, why do I believe certain things? Do I really believe certain things? And so on. And so it's a very stimulating exercise to discuss with you, these things.
Sure. Absolutely. Barakallahu
feekum. And the other thing is, beyond my position right now at the Religious Freedom Institute, which is a sort of multi-faith organization that originally began as a research project at Georgetown University that was studying religious freedom, and then it spun off to become its own organization where I deal with I'm in charge of the Islam questions there. But also I have my background. I have a sort of activist background, and also have a So there's a lot of, I see a lot of myself that I see in the subjects that you're discussing. I worked with many Ikhwan al-Muslimin, Muslim Brotherhood groups for for decades, and then and also was involved in the Salafi movement, and also was involved. People can apologize for the wind blowing here.
There's we're not hearing it, which is fantastic.
Oh, good.
Yeah, the sound is great.
That's awesome. And then those who can who want to Google me or something can find that I spent 13 and a half years in federal prison due to my involvement with an organization called Lashkar-e-Taiba, which is a Kashmir-based organization affiliated with the Pakistani military that's fighting against the Indian, India in Kashmir, which I no longer have anything to do with, and haven't for at least 20 years now. But but anyway, I have a lot of, and then also I fought in Bosnia and with the Bosnian army and an Arab unit there. And so
I read about that in Darrell Lee's book.
Umar Lee's book.
Darrell Lee.
Different people, very,
very, very different people. Yes.
Very different people. Yeah, Darrell Lee. Some of my story can be found there, or it can also be found in Googling my indictment from 2003. But anyway, so I and I've traveled widely in the Muslim world, and by the way, a lot of these issues, again, the nature of your work that you do generally, and of this specific book, is that it's so it's so at the core of what's important when it comes to the transition of Islamic civilization from the decline, and at the end of, pre-modernity. I mean, like, for example, I'm always really fascinated by reading Ibn Khaldun's Muqaddimah, where he's just, he was really writing at the beginning of the end. Well, not really the beginning of the end. Let's say the end of the beginning of the end, I guess. Sure. But it's fascinating because for example, he writes in one place about what he's describing is happening in Italy, and he says that first of all, he's talking generally about Europe and how it's just completely, a wasteland. He mostly talks about like the Russians and the Slavs and stuff, and how they're just barbarians, basically. And then he discusses Italy, and he says, but we have heard. He says, and I'm just but we have heard that there's something happening there where there's some research happening and so on. He says Allah knows best what's happening there. We don't have any more information about that. And of course, what he's talking about, he's writing at the end of the 15th century. He's talking about the beginning of the Renaissance. And so that and so that Renaissance, which combines with or sort of influences like the developments like the Protestant Reformation, and then the French Revolution, and other things which lead and the technological revolutions and the Industrial Revolution and so on, which lead to modernity, which scholars like Leah Greenfeld have described as being synonymous really with the rise of the nation state. And so that and then there are really, really interesting writings that I've been just really scratching the surface on about the early encounters of the Muslims who were still in a pre-modern mentality, who began to encounter these ideas, whether through the invasion of Napoleon or through the Ottoman ambassador in Istanbul. It has very fascinating accounts of his experiences, in the diplomatic corps dealing with the French Revolution, and trying to wrap his head around what these revolutionaries are even talking about, what their concepts are. And so then we have, for example, Sayyid Qutb and Maududi and their kind of, and then before them, Muhammad Abdu and Jamaluddin al-Afghani and all these people, Rashad Rida, and how that influences then later, like the Ikhwan, the Iranian Revolution, and so on. And so we get to this sort of really fascinating place where, in the Muslim world, the successor states to of course, the end of the Ottoman Empire, they themselves were doing a lot of quote unquote modernizing, where they were adopting many of the same, at least administrative reforms that are associated with modernity, which themselves, they have, those things are not neutral ideologically. They have their own premises and effects. And likewise the codification of the Sharia with the Majalla and different things that happened, and then the rise, of course, of nationalism, which was massive. With the Greeks and the Serbs, and then then even the Muslims in the Balkans, Albanians and the Bosnians, and all these different things. And then the Arab, of course, the Arab. Now this is really critical. The Arab revolt, and the extent to which that eventually, originally began as sort of an elite thing, and then just sort of trickles down to the extent that we have now these, colonialism, of course, with the colonialism's destruction of the awqaf, and also
I think Muslims did a lot of that.
Yes.
It was post-colonial in temporally speaking, but actually,
certainly the Muslims did a great deal of that, but also the French in Algeria.
Right.
They carried out a lot. But you're absolutely right. We can't, this can't all be blamed on colonialism. Even most of it can't be blamed on colonialism.
In a sense, like the colonial period brings in a lot of those ideas that give rise to this situation, of course.
And then you have people today like I don't know, with like certain scholars who are Muslims and yet are saying crazy things like it's the awqaf or the reason for the backwardness of the Muslim world, which not to name any names, because I have personal friendships with some of these folks, but I mean,
Well,
honestly, honestly, it's
yeah.
in other contexts. I'll address those.
Sure,
If you want to
sure.
name names, you can. But this
Sure, sure.
it's a very very strange
I
idea.
critiqued Timur Kuran's work a couple of
Yes,
weeks ago. A couple
yeah.
of weeks ago at one of my seminars, which was broadcast in this way as well. So,
Oh,
it's
goodness gracious. I mean,
yeah.
that would be a really interesting person to have on. Would be you and then Ahmed Kuru as well with his.
Yes, the two of them. I was asked
Yeah,
a question about Ahmed Kuru at a seminar at Oxford, and I
yeah.
mean, I basically said, well, actually, alongside that, I'm more familiar with Quran's work than I am with
Yeah,
Kuru's work, although, but
yeah.
yeah, I mean, I find that sort of stuff really just quite,
Bizarre.
y-
Frankly, it's bizarre. With all due respect to them,
yeah,
and I actually love Ahmed Kuru as a human being. I think he's a really
sure,
lovely,
sure.
a lovely
He comes
person.
across
Very.
as a lovely guy in his introduction as well, so
He is
he's very
wonderful.
personal. Yeah,
He's wonderful. He's a
yeah,
wonderful man, and he's a very intelligent man. But I just think that this is another person who would be really interesting to
sure.
to dig a little deeper and to tease out what are some of the assumptions and the understandings that he might have that differ. Now the reason I went through all of that is
Yeah,
to say
yeah.
that you're well. I also want to say one other thing, which is there's those who would want to spend the 2 hours, inshallah, it's beneficial time spent listening to our past conversation will hear that we spent a great deal of time on discussing many many important things, but yet leaving many things unsaid. And I think that today what we want to do, is to get deeper into some of those things that we left that were unsaid. And one of those things to
Sure.
me is really this notion of and you have alluded to into your introduction, which is the effect of criticizing scholars that align themselves with governments that in ways that seem, let's say, like unhelpful,
Problematic.
problematic, unhelpful at
Yeah.
best. I mean, I had a very when I first met. By the way, this is just by way of introducing this subject. We had this debate in the 90s. There was a very strong debate about those, and I was from the Salafi camp. Well, actually more like the Sahwa camp. The Sahwa camp, because I was aligned with Sheikh Safar al-Hawali
Fascinating stuff.
and Sulaiman al-Auda, who I was very close with. Indirectly, I was the student of a student of them, and so I was
Right.
very much aligned with them. But so the issue and the question was, what do you do with respect to scholar or ulama? Back then, it was like, okay, you have Bin Baz, you have Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen, you have these ulama who are like, they're aligned with these governments, which are at that time the Saudi government, had a lot of tendencies that were deemed to be un-Islamic. Of course, now,
Mashallah. Those were different times. We had different ways of assessing these.
Yeah, those were different times. And subhanAllah, when I got out of prison, which was in the end of 2016, December 2016, I was on Twitter, which I had just discovered. I mean, this was a new thing to me, and I was we had at the time a very robust. In the 90s, we had a very robust online community, which was very elite, and very few people were aware of it. But but many of those people then migrated to in the interim, when social media got big. So I'm on Twitter, and I was coming across some of the same brothers who I used to, we used to be like kind of on the same page with, and I mentioned something along the lines of discussing, I think I was discussing Sheikh bin Baya, who I really loved. He wasn't a Salafi, but I really loved him because of, I had actually met him in 2001. And I was familiar with his work from before that. And so I mentioned Sheikh bin Baya and how much I loved him. And this brother criticized him. I said, well, for being aligned with, what I don't know. At that time, it wasn't UA, but anyway, it was someone. And I said, I said, look, the thing is that, I said, we understand. I said, brother, what's wrong with you? We understand that these ulama are not themselves personally committed to the wrongdoing of these governments. They're simply, let's say for whatever benefits that they think that they're, able to carry out.
It's a maslaha-based judgment.
A maslaha-based judgment, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
And he says, oh, well, we don't talk like that anymore. We don't think that anymore. And I was like, what do you mean? I mean, so in many ways, if someone wants to know where I'm coming from, look at me as like a Rip Van Winkle or like a time traveler who just comes out of like a deep sleep or a time machine and is trying to figure out what's going on. So when you're talking to me now, okay, in the past 5 years I've gotten a little bit more hip to what's happening, but look at me as someone who you're trying to explain something to, all this past, that has gone by, and they don't know what happened. That's kind of where you're talking to someone from that. Yeah. So I just want to say that, like, my instinct when I read all of this criticism of ulama is to say, look, okay, we benefit from Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayy, we benefit from these scholars. So, or like Sheikh al-Fawzan, I'm not even Salaf anymore, but I see like a lot of benefit of Sheikh al-Fawzan. Or when I see someone like attacking Abdurrahman al-Sudais, Sheikh al-Sudais, and attacking him at a masjid, to me, my instinct is to say, back off, because we can say, all right, you've got this. You may even have made some mistakes, or you may even feel like you have to say certain things, but we can all just ignore those things. Look at we have Imam az-Zamakhshari, who was Mu'tazila, and begins his tafsir with Alhamdulillah alladhi khalaqa al-Quran, and we say A'udhu billah, and we say A'udhu billah, and we still take from him, so how can we not give a pass to some of these folks and not tear them down? And so this is what became to me sort of frustrating when I saw people like certain folks who would get online and then become really. Now your discussion is quite
can I briefly just interject?
Sorry.
Just very briefly to say to people who are asking questions, and we've got a lot of questions. Jazakumullah khairan.
Which I cannot see. Please, if you want to, you go ahead and pick whichever you think
I can pick those. So please bear with us, because we do want to get through quite a bit of discussion. But if some of these questions do become pertinent to it, we will definitely get to them, especially the ones which have come so early on. We will definitely get to those. I suspect in the second hour of our discussion. And we hope that you'll stick around for that. But please bear with us, inshallah. And someone was saying Ahmed who? I'm not sure which Ahmed was mentioned in this case.
Ahmed, I'm not sure. I don't know what.
This was a lot of names have been mentioned. Okay, so barakallah fikum. So with respect to, this is some interesting background. I think. You were just about to say, well, your book is a little different than that.
Yes.
Yes. Yeah.
Your work is much more measured. You're not one of these folks. And I'm just going to say there was a slew of articles and op-eds that came out on like Al Jazeera and other sort of Qatar influenced or Qatar aligned outlets that were really, really out of to me. They're just out of line in the nature of the attack, which to me, okay, now I'll just put it out. This is another phenomenon which I'm noticing. In the old days, you wouldn't see, even if there was some criticism like that, right? You wouldn't see just the raw, let's say, lack of adab. Now everyone says, oh, the adab card, and they mock that, but actually adab is an important thing when we discuss ulama and so on. You know what I'm saying? We could,
it is.
Yeah. So you see people like coming, and attacking in a vicious way. Yeah.
I think, if you'll forgive me, I think, there's always. I don't think there's been much change, to be honest. What's his name? And someone's asking. I just remember we were discussing Ahmed Kuru. So someone very kindly, someone by the name of Muhammad said.
Thank you.
He clarified the question by saying, "Who's Ahmed Kuru?" Like, is that the question you're asking? Ahmed Kuru, just incidentally, he wrote a book called Islam and Authoritarianism, where he basically, takes largely based on secondary literature in English. I don't think he reads Arabic, unfortunately, and that's the tragedy of a text like that in my view, and that's why it's the sort of book which I hope to sort of like engage and in all likelihood critique in sort of future. But forgive me, I was sidetracked from your. What you're saying. I'm reminded of a. Sort of a doctoral dissertation defense I attended of a colleague of mine, someone who's in the history department at Oxford now, but he was doing his PhD at Princeton as well. And Anthony Grafton, a very sort of eminent intellectual historian, he said, look, I always come to these things by saying there's nothing new under the sun. Like, everything that you've got to say has been said already.
Yeah.
It's kind of his. I mean, like, he's a very brilliant scholar, and when someone like that says something, I mean, you take it seriously. And the thing is, where was the adab when the Khawarij behaved the way they did, right? Like, we've always had these sorts of issues throughout Islamic history. Like, how many sultans throughout history were assassinated? Or if you think about the Mamluk period, which was one of the most illustrious periods in sort of middle Islam, so to speak, with some of the greatest scholars of hadith and fiqh and brilliant sort of like efflorescence of Islamic scholarship in Egypt and Damascus and all of these sorts of places.
Yeah.
And what was happening in the political realm? Like, people were being assassinated left, right, and center. Like, the one Mamluk is going and killing the other person, and the scholars, of course, are all kind of like, in some respects, integral to the judiciary. Of course, I mean, without them, the judiciary doesn't operate. And who's appointed? Like Ibn Hajar and Badruddin al-Aini. You think of the sort of mutual clashes that they had. Shaykh al-Islam, both of them really, and in a sense, like, the historical narrations talk about how the Mamluk sort of ruler at the time would, if he was upset with one of them, remove him from his post of Shaykh al-Islam and replace him with the other, and then vice versa. So, those sorts of roles, and sometimes they would write critically of each other. They'd write poetry against each other, right? And these are great ulama, some of the greatest ulama of our time, but they're human beings, right? كل يؤخذ من قوله ويترك إلا صاحب هذا القبر. Like, they say سيف الحجاج ويعني لسان ابن حزم, or they'll say that about Ibn al-Arabi, the sort of the Maliki, like his like some of his comments about other ulama are just a bit embarrassing. Like, if you're mild-mannered like me, where he says قد زلت أقدام العلماء في هذه المسألة كلهم, or something like this. وأخطاء العلماء على قدرهم. Right? Like, the mistakes of ulama are as great as they are. Right? I mean, such a funny way of. Now, that sort of behavior has always been around. We're human beings. We make mistakes.
Well, let me really quickly interject.
Sure, please.
I don't mean that there weren't. I mean, for example, your example of the Khawarij. Yes, there's nutcases. That's true. I just mean to say that.
But Ibn Arabi, Qadi Abu Bakr is not a nutcase, right?
No. No, and that's the other. Okay. So you have, on the one hand, you have the nutcases who are just Khawarij, who are like ready to slaughter people. Yeah. And then on the other hand, you have ulama who are they have their own way of talking with one another. You know what I mean? And so so they didn't really like. I don't know whether or not they actually took it personally when someone would say something like what you mentioned. You know what I mean? But in any event, that's their.
Sometimes they did. Right?
Okay, sometimes they may have. Sometimes they may have. But I'm not talking about those.
And that's why Munafarat al-Aqran in Jarh wa Ta'dil, they say that when Malik said about Muhammad ibn Ishaq, يعني دجال من الدجاجلة, you don't take that because he's Aqran, they just don't like each other.
Right. But here's the thing, right? We're neither Khawarij nor are we ulama to be, on the level of the ulama to be speaking to one another in that fashion. And by the way, that same thing that you mentioned, like a lot of people would say that, would say, oh, well, why can't I talk? Back in the 90s, I'm like, why can't I talk about Bin Baz like that? Because so and so said this about so and so, and it's like. Yeah, but we're not that. You know what I mean? We're not them. What I mean to say is that. Okay, so if you indulge,
the sad reality, Sheikhna, is that I've studied with ulama of various stripes,
right?
But it's unfortunately the reality is the people who speak in this way about the ulama, they learn this from other ulama. I've studied with ulama. And these are respected people. I don't want to name anyone here because it's just so embarrassing to sort of like. But they're in their classes, among their khawas of their students, and they're bad-mouthing great scholars of their time. Okay, I mean, some of these scholars have issues, but you can see it's purely out of, like, it's not advancing anything, right?
Yeah.
And that's obviously.
This is one phenomenon. Phenomenon is the students, right? So you have these students who hear this type of stuff and then they start indulging in it. So we know
then they think, look, this is fine. The ulama are doing this, so why shouldn't I?
Right,
He's
but
warning them against the other person, and that's the thing. This is a judgment call so often.
Exactly. So that's one phenomenon. Okay, but I'm not really referring to. It's interesting. So we've now teased out three different phenomena of people who will attack ulama. But what I'm talking about is the type of person who knows better than these, or should know better than these students, because many of these students are just. I mean, well, I'm talking about people who don't appear to have ever really sat with people of knowledge, and so that, or so they don't have a lot of, let's say, like people who are coming into these kind of discourses from backgrounds that don't include sitting with a lot of
but these people have always existed. They've always existed, and the difference between our own time, in my estimation, for what it's worth, Sidi, and historical times is nobody cared about these people historically. Like, when Muslims had the...
Sorry? I'm just talking about the 90s.
I know. But I mean, like, I remember some of that. I was reasonably young. I was a teenager in the 90s, and a lot of the 90s I didn't spend in the UK in the first place. I was living in Saudi Arabia at the time. Oh, hello? Okay, I think we've lost our brother. So we'll just wait for him. Inshallah, he'll be able to reconnect before long. In the meantime, I just want to apologize to friends and colleagues who are watching and putting out comments. I'd like to sort of address them, but I guess one of the brothers is saying, Assalamu alaikum, Priyo al-Azami, sir. So someone's writing this from Bangladesh. So, wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah to Brother Muhammad Hilal Hussein. But aside from that, hopefully we've answered the Ahmed Kuru question, and we will come back to sort of the other question with respect to the other questions when the brother is back online. So please bear with us for a moment. It seems that his internet has cut off, and I'm going to sort of try and message him briefly, and in the meantime, please bear with us, inshallah. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. So your internet cut out briefly, so hopefully, I'm not sure exactly. Your internet was a bit weak for a short period, but it's great to have you back. We just need you to be on your side, because your cameras, you need to sort of adjust your camera.
I'm really sorry about that.
That's fine. Oh, it's gone again. Okay. So if this is the case, unfortunately, hopefully we'll try another couple of times, but if this is the case, unfortunately we'll probably have to reschedule. But in order to sort of do justice to the people who have asked questions, I will at the very least sort of stick around and sort of answer those questions. But let's see how things go. My colleague just said that his phone, unfortunately, on which he was based, has died, so he's going to join on his laptop now. So that's something which, inshallah, should be fine. Bi-idhnillah ta'ala. Okay, so at least we know what's going on. I'm going to go ahead and answer a couple of questions, inshallah, and hopefully we can come back to these with Brother Ismail. But actually, I wanted to sort of comment on some of Brother Zariab's sort of comments. So I'm going to put these on the screen. He's saying perpetuation of mass murder by court clerics isn't really an outlier in Islamic history, though massacre of Al-Harra, Karbala, the massacre of Al-Harra, Karbala were justified by different scholars. I think that's absolutely true, of course. Like Ibn Arabi al-Maliki saying Hussein was killed by the sword of his father, for example. So Ibn al-Arabi, I mean, he has some very sort of, in my view, some very problematic statements, but he has a fascinating and controversial book, Awasim min al-Qawasim, which is worth sort of looking at. And then he adds, Zariab is adding here, for me it's interesting how MB and Qaradawi brand of Islam was promoted by the Foreign Office and Maqbul Ali. We can talk about that. I mean, I don't think that just happens to be an accident of history. I actually knew Maqbul Ali when he was at university, and he helped participate in the organization of a sort of summer Arabic course which I attended in 2002, and that's where I met Bin Bayyah. Well, actually, that's where I heard of Bin Bayyah for the first time. Bin Bayyah couldn't make it to that session, so Ziryab adds, as was borne out in Martin Bright's paper, when progressives treat, I think you mean something slightly different, when progressives meet with reactionaries, the British state's flirtation with radical Islamism. So, I mean, we can, like, that's obviously Martin Bright talking out of his, I won't use any sort of colourful language here, but, those sorts of things, describing Khaladawi as that kind of radicalism or flirtation with radicalism.
Assalamu alaikum.
Is wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullah. Well, I was just engaging. Yes, I can hear you now, and this is actually nice and clear. You're looking great, so inshallah that shouldn't be a problem. Yeah, I mean, like, I was just reading some very interesting comments from a chap called Ziryab, which I found myself largely agreeing with. Towards the end, we were looking at something distinctly within the British context, which I thought could be framed very differently. But I'm just going to put this on the screen, and perhaps you can comment on it as well.
Okay.
That the perpetuation of mass murder by court clerics isn't really an outlier in Islamic history. The massacre of Al-Harra, Karbala, etc., were justified by different scholars. And then he adds, like Ibn Arabi al-Maliki, one we were talking about, saying Hussein was killed by his own sword, or by the sword of his father, for example. This is I assume, in Awasim al-Qawasim. And I mean, my comment was, of course, there are always scholars who can sign off on that stuff. My issue isn't that certain scholars are doing that if they're court clerics and they're not sort of really, they're not of high standing. It's just the problem for me with these figures. Bin Bayyah far more so than Ali Gum'a has kind of been a colourful character for a long time, but and Ahmed al-Tayyib is complicated. But Bin Bayyah in particular, I think, the sorts of choices that they make, which, as you alluded to in our last conversation, is kind of this genuflection or absolute capitulation to the nation state. That's where, and the thing about Bin Bayyah is he's not any old scholar in my view. He's like a very brilliant scholar. He's like one of the great scholars of our time, as it were. He has an encyclopedic knowledge of the Islamic tradition, and he's always been recognized in that way. So that I found particularly troubling, and that's why I felt the need to sort of really explore that dimension of it. And to be honest, I didn't reflect on this question quite so systematically. What does it mean for scholars? I was encouraged to by one of my readers, David Warren, very kindly read through my manuscript and gave me some feedback. But I hope to explore that perhaps later on, inshallah.
Yeah. Well, so here's the thing. I don't think I agree with you. I mean, I with the commentator there, that I don't think it's that unique.
Yeah.
But there are a lot of unique things about our era. You know what I mean? Like, one of the unique things, of course, is that the extent to which ulama are utter and complete total employees of the state. I mean, someone's going to come back inevitably and say, "Oh no, you're anyway, one of the people that we mentioned before, and say, "Oh no, that's not the case at all times or at various times in Islamic history. The ulama were in bed with the
I mean, no, not really. Not really.
No, well,
I mean,
but someone will
no
say,
one can really claim that. I don't think.
People do claim that. People do claim that.
I mean, no one who is informed of Islamic history and knows the way in which sort of the ulama conducting themselves, I think, can claim that reasonably. I mean, it doesn't make a great deal of sense. Like the state, the Mihna illustrates this most dramatically fairly early on, and that kind of sets the paradigm for the relationship.
Well, what can be said with some accuracy, without going to that absurd anachronistic extent, is to say that there are various times throughout history in which the ulama have been more or less aligned with with the rulers. You know what I mean, to some extent or another. I mean, but it's really, they're far more. I mean, the level of independence is of a qualitative difference, not just
Absolutely.
quantitative, but qualitative difference.
Modernity
Yeah,
versus
with
pre-modernity.
modernity.
Yeah,
Yes,
absolutely.
exactly.
Absolutely.
Yeah, I mean, so you know, it's a for those who've studied, it's almost cliche to point out of the different let's say stages which the late Ottoman period took to really turn the ulama into employees, and then with the successor states. I'll give you an example. I mean, like
Yeah.
I was I was giving a lecture to a small group of ulama from North Africa. So it was like Algerians and Tunisians,
Right.
so Libyans, and I was explaining to them that when I was advising them, because I was kind of supposed to be advising them. I guess this was like what I was kind of like expected to be. I'm not going to talk about the context, but anyway, it didn't really make a lot of sense as I was saying it, because I was like, what, for these folks,
Yeah.
I was advising them that the best thing for religion in their countries would be for them to have some independence from the state, and yet
Yeah.
I'm talking to people who are all here because they've all been flown here by their
Yeah.
state governments, and they're all employees. It's not even rational. It doesn't even make sense to talk about ulama who are not
Yeah.
state employees, because otherwise you're on the out. You're some sort of like rebel. Like Sheikh al-Albani, Sheikh al-Albani, for example, who did, just a total example. I mean, just random example of someone who is
Yeah.
not really state affiliated, but so he's
Yeah.
kind of like banned from speaking, and he's banned from having students. And the reason I mention him is because he's distinct from, let's say, like frauds who are like fraud students who are like who are perhaps rightfully
Right.
no one
Called
should be
ulama
listening to them.
Yeah,
Right, exactly. Yeah, put the suit on,
yeah.
and like but they're like janitors or something. I mean, that's actually a literal example of I mean, a
Right.
real life example.
Yeah, it doesn't surprise me. It doesn't surprise me.
Yeah. So
We're living in a very unusual time in that respect
we're
in
living in
Islamic history.
an unusual time, and perhaps actually there are few exceptions to that. One being uniquely enough, Saudi Arabia. I mean, Saudi Arabia is not really in the same category, because they didn't go through the same process.
Absolutely. Anyone who wants to really see the Saudi case, you should read Islam in Saudi Arabia by Frank Vogel. I think that's the book, published around 1993. Fantastic text.
Interesting. Or, for example, Pakistan is a little different, and Bosnia is a little different. Indonesia is a little bit different. You know what I mean?
Right.
So these countries, nation states, are places that don't entirely play by that playbook. So we have that unique situation. Now, what I wanted to mention, that you mentioned about Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayya and his genuflection to the nation state. I have 2 points to make about that. One,
right.
I'm not going, because genuflection is a kind of ibadah. I know that's rhetoric.
No, I'm using it obviously in a metaphorical sense, obviously. Yeah.
Yes, but what I do think, and the text that I'm referring to specifically, where he outlines his theory, is I forget the name of it, but it's a booklet that's kind of a synopsis of a lecture that he gave at the first. It was at the first Forum for Promoting Peace, and it's his address there, and that was like published as a book. And as I wanted to talk about very briefly, because then I'll let you comment, why I found what he said so mistaken, with all due respect to the Sheikh, and that is that the question that he was addressing was, and I believe he addressed it as a bit of a straw man, not necessarily, but in other words, I just don't think he was going at it from hitting the essence of what the actual issue was. What he was addressing was this question of the division of the Muslim world into different authorities, in terms of, all right, we got Egypt over there and you got Jordan over there. So is that lawful? Is that correct Islamically? And he was saying, he was explaining yes, because, and he was talking about, I don't know, like at different times when you had like the Umayyad over in,
it's always been the case.
Right, so exactly. It's never been like a utopia of of all under one ruler.
I'm not sure it would be a utopia if it was all under one. Right? I mean, like.
Well, it is part of the way that many people erroneously
conceive of it today, because of the way in which we've modernized. Right, we think about centralized states and things like that. But when the Prophet
he's trying to say that state of affairs, not only is it has never happened, and it is not something desirable, and it's not something that is useful or particularly, but here's the problem. The problem is he's not addressing what is the nature of the nation state. The nature of the nation state is not simply that it's different, authorities. I mean, there's an extent. The problem is that as we mentioned last time, the problem is that the state is itself God. There's a beautiful book, a brief book that's it's called The God of Modernity, and it's and the God of modernity is the nation state. I don't have the author for you right now, but Google it, God of Modernity. Very worth ordering on Amazon. Brief book, and Leah Greenfeld discusses it well. A great scholar of nationalisms. So what I want to say is that Sheikh Abdullah did not address any of that, and my thrust to you, sir, is I believe that the Ikhwan do not really challenge it either. I think that in my humble opinion, my provocative statement to you is that when we compare Sheikh Abdullah with the Sheikh Khaladawi and others, they're also not. Neither of them are
actually.
Really
it doesn't apply to Sheikh Khaladawi, but it does apply to the Ikhwan more generally. Yeah. Let's go into that.
Tell me why.
All right. So what's interesting about Sheikh bin Bayyah is sort of just briefly one of the thoughts that I had as you were saying that is, Sheikh bin Bayyah is one of the things he's been doing over the last few years, particularly in his current role in the United Arab Emirates as kind of like a religious ambassador and the Grand Mufti and all of these things, is to take something very banal, say something very banal, but use it towards something which is like quite to allow for it to be used in a way that is quite pernicious in my view. So the comment that, of course, there have always been sort of different... I mean, the point I was making is there's never been a situation where you have a centralized Islamic state that controls everything in every region. It's always been highly devolved. In pre-modern times, it wasn't possible for us to have centralized states in the way that we think of today, right? So people were largely autonomous in the regions. They just needed to give allegiance to the central land. Even the zakah was distributed locally. That was the ideal, right? I mean, Umar radiallahu anhu and various other people expressed dismay when zakat was coming to their lands and told Mu'adh bin Jabal, "What are you doing in Yemen?" Or I think it was Mu'adh bin Jabal. And he said, "Well, no one needs it here, so we're sending it to the central sort of place, right?" And so, that's one of those myths that we create. A lot of kind of like people have in the modern period.
We read our period back into the history,
But what Sheikh bin Bayyah is doing by pointing something that's quite so banal out is he's basically saying to these people, like, then he's doing like a sort of a logical jump. There's all sorts of fallacies on the way because they don't follow, right? From that you don't get to, so the system that we have right now in the Middle East is fine. Right? Like the system we have in the Middle East is disastrous in so many ways. If these were all local principalities, which, from an ideal Islamic perspective, would give allegiance to one central Amir al-Mu'mineen, from an ideal Islamic perspective, we're a bit far from that, but, that's not very difficult to realize. That's actually what someone like Qaradawi explicitly calls for. He says, look, you have all of these nation states, but you need to have, like, an imam that can be sort of pledged allegiance to by all of the various, wilayat. He doesn't necessarily use that term, but various heads of state can have that kind of relationship. And if you think about the pragmatism of the Prophet ﷺ, he would go to places and say, look, you stay in power, we don't have a problem, right? The people that we've been fighting, we don't have a problem with you. Muslims don't, in theory, need to have a problem with the people who are in charge of various places. It's only where there's blood and where there's other things, you need to have some kind of restitution, obviously, where people have been literally killed by rulers who have been unjust and so on. That's a slightly different affair. But the thing that Qaradawi says basically is like, just to finish this one point, like Qaradawi says, look, we do need to bring back the Islamic model is not the nation state. He literally explicitly says, look, we can think about bringing back a khilafah, and it could be a federal or confederal model, right? We can look at something like the European Union or the United States. That's what they're doing. They're these enormous multi sort of like state, United States, they're all independent states technically. Europe is more sort of like independent. It's a recent project and it's not been very successful in the way that the United States federal government has got the allegiance of the states. No one's thinking about breaking away or anything like that. I mean, I'm a bad example. I'm a Brit, right? Although I voted against Brexit, just for what it's worth. And that all that project isn't something that I'm invested in from an ideological or philosophical perspective. I'm just saying that for Britain, particularly Muslims in Britain, it would have been good to stay within the EU. Now, I mean, Qaradawi says those sorts of things explicitly, and then he at one point I can't remember where what the context was, but like he was kind of being interrogated on it, saying, well, what about the nation state or something along those lines? And he's like, can Muslims not even dream? Like we're not saying we're going to have this tomorrow, but we're so suppressed in our sort of like, we can't even aspire to something which reflects our belief system, right? Like you can have a nation state system, you can have the United Nations in the way that you can aspire, like if you're in a Muslim country and you aspire to secular sort of like polity, there are plenty of champions for you in the West who will talk you up and say, you're the greatest thing. We have to support people like this. And there are people standing in parliaments in various Western nations today saying, it's our duty to support those people over there who are calling for our system of government. And Muslims can't theoretically, in places like, in their centers like Al-Azhar or other places. Yes, I mean, like Uwaymir Anjum sometimes points out, and he's written about these sorts of things. He's saying that he quotes this Economist article which was saying was the abolishment of the caliphate a 100-year-old mistake. This was published in not exactly 100 years ago, but one of the arguments in that article is, well, if you don't have a good example, does that mean you'll have all these disastrous examples? This was at the height of ISIS, basically.
Yeah.
And if the Economist can see it and say it, well, you can say it if you're sort of like, if you're part of the West. You can't say it if you're Muslim, because now you're a threat, you're securitized, and all of those sorts of things. Anyway, so that's my rant over.
Yeah, I mean, you raised a lot of things there. I mean, one thing. First of all, I obviously completely agree with your characterization of historical models of governance. I mean, this was that characteristic of empires in general. The Byzantine Empire. There, a lot of people don't know, there was in Constantinople, there was actually a Muslim quarter. There was, religious minorities were treated somewhat similar to the dhimmi system. In fact, Salahuddin Ayyubi, in one of his treaty with the Byzantine Empire, actually secured a masjid for the Muslims, and so
that's how it works.
In Constantinople, that's how it works. You have you see how and a big part of the reason. Well, let me say that the reason I mentioned that Qaradawi, in my view, does not really challenge many of the premises of the nation state, because it's not just a matter of, let's say, like levels of authority. That's a very significant issue, but also you have and I don't necessarily blame him or anyone for this, really, but there's a dehumanization of the and a flattening that comes about when all these levels of hierarchy that separate the individual from the center are crushed and flattened, and so you have this comes along with sort of the destruction of guilds, the destruction of tribes, the destruction of ulama as a class, the destruction of of these different of clans.
I'm still a bit confused why you're saying Qaradawi is not opposed to the nation state.
Yeah, because it's not that I'm saying he's not. It's not that I'm saying he's not opposed to the nation state. I don't think he's grappled with the full with the full spectrum of what has changed, and I'll give an example. I mean,
he's far more reflective. Again, in his writings, is far more reflective than I've seen from Bin Bayya, for example.
And now
specifically on these questions.
The reason that I, this is why it's great to have this conversation with you, because I wanted to be challenged on why I'm misunderstanding or perhaps something. But you wrote a paper which I thought was really fascinating. Unfortunately, I didn't save it when it was free. Now you have to pay for it, if I were to
No,
look
you just
on
all
LibGen,
academic papers. It's legitimate for academics to send copies to individuals who've asked for
yeah,
them. So you send me an
yeah.
email,
Well,
I'll send it to you. No
if I
problem at all.
if I were to look for it on LibGen, I would find that it is
Yeah.
not there.
Huh.
Yeah, for some reason, and
Okay.
I have actually looked for it on it, but I'll email you and ask you for it. But it was in the
Sure, sure.
The
The
Muslim
Muslim
world, and
world,
it was
yeah. Abdullah bin
yeah
Bayya and yeah,
yeah, and
yeah.
it was really interesting because your premise was, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but your premise
Sure, sure.
was something along the lines, which I actually agree with. Your premise was along
Mm.
the lines of, um, okay, it was, if I could characterize it, it was Bin Bayya
Sure, sure.
is wrong in opposing Qaradawi
Yeah,
because Bin Bayya and Qaradawi actually have quite similar views. And in fact,
yeah,
Qaradawi is more along the lines of what Bin Bayya aspires to be than Bin Bayya himself.
yeah, yeah.
I mean, now I hope
That's
I
not
did
that's
not.
not actually that. Yeah, so that's not the
Okay,
point of the
yeah,
article. The point of the
yeah,
article is to show that, Qaradawi and Bin Bayya, there's this narrative that's been created that, Bin Bayya
right.
is someone who's kind of making Islam safe for the nation state. But if you
Mm-hmm.
go and read someone like Shadi Hamid, I mean, he argues, I think, reasonably compellingly, actually, in Islamic
Mm-hmm.
exceptionalism, that Islamists, one of their sort of like primary focus in recent sort of decades has been to make Islam safe for the nation state. Now,
Yeah, exactly.
Qaradawi participates in that to a certain extent, but it's to different ends. We can talk about what those ends are. So we're talking, for the interest of people, when we use the term Islamist, Ikhwan-oriented people.
Yeah,
Now,
that's. I
the
just want
Ikhwan
to
as
point
a...
out that that's
Tafadhal.
what I was referring to. That's what I was referring to when I'm talking about
Yeah.
Sheikh
But
Islam,
again,
and I'm
what
not
am I
just
doing in the
I'm not just
article?
brand.
I'm not
Yeah,
necessarily
yeah,
making these global claims about, I'm not making global claims about whether or not, these people are for or against the nation state in principle
hmm
overall. Because people are also engaging pragmatically with realities, right? I mean, you have Amum
yes,
al-Balwa, you have all
exactly.
sorts of mechanisms, including within our
Yeah,
religious tradition. I mean, I was just, I just posted on a friend's Facebook about this the other day, that the question of like, oh, the Qataris are going to have, they're mulling over the question of whether to serve alcohol in stadiums, right?
right.
And so he posted it, and he was saying that, this is a discussion, this is a tension between God's law and, football fans' desires, so to speak. And I said, actually, it gets a bit more complicated than that, right? I mean, Qaradawi is fascinating because he's so... you have to appreciate that scholars in places like the Middle East, who, especially those who don't know English, and have not been exposed to the sort of colonial centers where knowledge is produced on a scale which supersedes most of these peripheral regions, cannot be expected to know the fine details of like the discourses that of history and civilizational dynamics and all of these sorts of things. Yet Qaradawi surprises me constantly by knowing a lot more than I expect him to, shall we say. Because a lot of the time, these people know what's been translated through, vehicles like Al Jazeera, which is news media. It's only giving you a snippet. It's not like reading, tomes and tomes,
Yeah,
hundreds of volumes on this by serious scholars who are, with detailed footnotes. Yet, despite that, he's basically saying, look, we're dealing with the nation state as a reality, as a pragmatic reality. Yet, I am still writing books like Ad-Din wa Siyasa. I'm still writing books like, there's this other one, Islam al-Almaniya, Wajhan li Wajh, and various other texts. I mean, his political texts are fewer than his more strictly fiqhi or religious or, Quranic
yeah,
hermeneutic texts and so on. But he's still writing those texts where he, has this clear sense, which is very often lacking among a lot of ulama whom I read, including, unfortunately, Sheikh bin Bayya, whom I think he's so learned that it's difficult for me to understand that as anything but a deliberate elision of certain understandings. But, understanding the difference of the nature of the public sphere in the modern era compared to how it was in, historically. The fact that
yeah,
the ulama basically, I mean, I cite this one place in the book, but from his book, Din wa Siyasa, he basically says, look, historically, the ulama controlled the public sphere. They controlled the education system. They controlled the judiciary. They controlled and the state was this tiny affair that didn't really dictate any of this stuff. They were
right. That's
dependent on these bureaucrats, and all the bureaucrats were ulama. So that Sharia mindedness, which term from sort of Marshall Hodgson, imbued the entire system.
Yeah.
And now the post-colonial state sort of basically has excised all of that, replaced the normative sort of like system. It's embedded within a global system which imposes norms which are often antithetical to the Islamic sort of like normative universe. And then it's like, well, Qaradawi accepts that. No, actually, he's written explicitly against it, but he works also pragmatically because he needs to give Muslims solutions right now on the principle of fattaqullaha mastata'tum.
Yeah,
Right?
yeah.
Yeah.
That's a very good point. I mean, it's. I think what I'm frustrated by, not by you, but what I'm frustrated with, and I think what a lot of Muslims are frustrated with who are thinking about this stuff, and probably you're frustrated with, is that to me, I don't see like Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayy. Okay, set aside the UAE issue because yes, I find that problematic, but I think that that's probably again a maslaha type of decision. I don't see him out there, I don't see he's not Ahmed Tayyib or something, and he's not or Adi Goma.
No, he's worse. He's worse. He's worse than Ahmed Tayyib, in my view.
Oh, I don't.
Ahmed Tayyib has been giving Sisi a hard time for the last 3-4 years.
Ahmed Tayyib,
Ahmed Tayyib explicitly opposed. He's not Ali Jum'ah. Oh, okay, that's a different.
That's my point. You know what I'm saying? But so
that's a very low bar, bro. Right? I mean, like, he's not a criminal. Yeah, I'm happy he's not. He's not someone who's actively calling for people's murder.
No, but he's not. My point is that he's. My point is that his affiliation with the UAE can be seen as a sort of, as a sort of way of
minimizing sort of conflict in the region, and I can understand that.
No, that's not even what I mean. That's not what I. That's not even what I mean. What I mean is, like, he's got Sheikh Abdullah has, I think, a project, and he has a vision, and he needs resources to carry it out. You know what I mean? And he's like, okay, well, he's over here with with Mauritania, he's over here with Qatar, he's over here with and Saudi Arabia for a while, and now here's UAE, and he just is looking for various let's say patrons to fund his project that his projects that I think he wants to carry out. Now, that's how I say it, and I excuse it. And to the extent that there's sin in that, and the extent that there's harm in that, I think it's better to give that a pass and not to let's say like harp on it. That's just my view. But let's get back to what I said.
All right, we'll get back to this as well at some point, but inshallah.
We shall. And my same point is to be made about someone like Sheikh Fawzan. I'm not even Salafi, but I think there's a lot of benefit for him. My same point is to be made with many of these ulama who who I think continue to be beneficial in many ways if we are to ignore.
There's no question,
and like cabin aside, okay, here's their flaws. You know what I'm saying? Here's their flaws, and let's take their benefit. Yeah. No. Back to Sheikh bin Bayy. But my real frustration, because he's such a brilliant man, and he'll quote like Kant, and he'll quote like is like how could you miss the significance of the notion of what modernity? I mean, read S.E. Eisenstadt, read Leah Greenfeld, read Charles Taylor, read some of these people who are read Alistair McIntyre. Read these people who are exposing and bringing to light and helping, and read Strauss or Vogel, and read some of these people who are helping us to
he cites Strauss.
Yeah. Well, he does, but see, but
it's very superficial.
Okay. They're not. He has not escaped the paradigm. Okay, so what we need is, while being pragmatic and dealing with, all right, well, we have a situation where we have parliaments and we have an all powerful state. You know what I mean? We have a reality of a Leviathan. We have a reality. All right, so we have to deal with that, and but at the same time, like, can we envision how without some like obvious like a silliness of turning back the clock or something like that, can we envision a place where we can get to from here?
And this is what's so ironic about this, right? I mean, this is a conversation I had with Professor Jonathan Brown, Hafidhullah Jack, and I very much agree with his article on the UAE, and he has an article on Muslim matters where I think it's called "Keeping the Eye on the Ball" or something like that. Okay. The problems with the UAE, and I mean, he basically says, look, considering the UAE's, track record, and he lists a whole host of these, right? I mean, it would take a long time to list all of the criminal activity of the UAE. He was saying that anyone who thinks that it's appropriate to associate with this sort of like state on the international level should be prepared for all the criticism that is going to be directed at them.
Yeah,
this is very different.
Yeah,
this is very different, I think, from. I mean, at the same time, one of my regular viewers, Black Viper, his screen name, he's written up a list of like government scholars, and that's not the point of what I'm here to do, right? I mean, like, I've written about certain scholars here, but I don't think we need to sort of come up with blacklists in quite that sense. Although I think, we should be cognizant that people like Ali Gomaa, or in my view, sort of Abdullah bin Bayya, when they make these sorts of statements, I think, in the case of Ali Gomaa, whether it's, his sorts of public statements, which are even relatively innocuous when they are being done at the behest of the UAE, should be rejected because of the sorts of statements he makes at the, like, whether it's normalization of Palestine, whether it's calling Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, whether it's basically
but he didn't call them a terror. Abdullah bin Bayy did not call the Ikhwan a terrorist organization. When did he do that?
Yes, he did. I cite it in my book. I cite it in my book.
The Forum for now, if you're talking about the statement put out in the name of the Forum for Promoting Peace, yes, they did that, but Abdullah bin Bayy himself did not do that. Yeah.
No, but how can you make a distinction between the Forum and its president? Like, if it's being said in the name of the Forum, like, I tried to make that excuse when I initially sort of like reflected in 2017 about the criticism of Qatar, but I made that excuse because at that early stage it wasn't necessarily clear whether he would sort of clarify, whether he would separate himself from it. But incidentally, this time when it happened, it was issued through his own through his own sort of tweet, his own Twitter as well. So when that's happening, when it's being issued through his own outlets,
I didn't see that. I didn't see that. So I saw. And looking at that, I remember investigating that a little bit because I was, to me, what it looked like, it was another one of these shenanigans from the UAE government that,
but he's chosen to sort of like, but he's chosen to, he's made his bed, so to speak. Like he has chosen to associate with that government.
Look, we can agree. Sort of, look. Here's the thing. We can. I'll
okay. Yes. So this is on page 345. Forgive me. If you would just excuse me for a moment. So UAE Fatwa Council denounces Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization. This is footnote 100. So published 25th of November on the Middle East Eye. And then it's I add in the footnote, this time his personal Twitter account did retweet his statement from the Emirates Fatwa Council's official handle. Okay. So, I mean, that's my point, that he's, when calling something like the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization, which is basically like doing the dirty work of the UAE, and then his personal Twitter handle retweets that. I mean, he's completely gone in hook, line, and sinker, right?
No. I don't. I still don't. I still don't agree with that. I'm not
saying that sort of bending over backwards, I think, is part of our problem, because we need to be able to, draw a line under the sand. Draw a line in the sand where we say, look, certain things are unacceptable. Like entering into these sorts of partnerships.
I'm looking at your book right now. Okay, so the Middle East Eye, the Middle East Eye writes this, article. I'm looking at the footnote right now. I remember looking at the actual tweet, and the actual. I don't remember that coming from Sheikh Abdullah. I remember that coming from the.
No, he retweeted it. He retweeted it. The thing about retweets, this is the problem, Sheikh, because I included the actual tweet, but you cannot include a link to a retweet. Do you understand? Like, I tried to find the link to the retweet, but it doesn't have an independent link unto itself. So I know that's why I put it in writing. He in fact retweeted it, because I can't show with a link.
Right? I understand you. I understand what you're saying, but I mean, you could do like a screenshot or something. But anyway,
not in a book.
Saw that, I know. But if you saw that, I missed it. Okay. But here I think we come to the crux. Here I think we come to the crux. Okay. Is it? First of all, I don't know who's running his personal account. I seriously doubt the
Again,
man
look,
is.
look, you
The man
can't.
is.
I mean, like, it's true. You do iltimas al-udhr, but at certain points it gets a bit absurd, right? Sorry, you're on mute. Oh dear. Sorry, the sound is gone. Okay. I hope I can see viewers are still sticking around. You're very kind. I mean, this has basically become a private conversation between myself and Sidi Ismail. I'm going to actually now basically start addressing the questions. And when Brother Ismail comes back, I'm going to start addressing with him present and get his feedback on some of these questions as well. But we hope to sort of revisit an ongoing conversation. I'm pretty sure that this conversation could go on for quite a while. So, inshallah, he's actually restarting his computer because he said he lost sound. So please bear with him. He'll probably be back in 3 or 4 minutes. I'm going to go to Black Viper's first question, which was asked over an hour ago now. If you're still there, otherwise, hopefully you can sort of come back to a recording, inshallah. But you said, do you think Morsi or the Ikhwan could have ever won over scholars like Tayyib or Gum'a? That's a very interesting question. So this is going back, of course, for those who are less familiar. Basically, Ali Gum'a and Ahmad Tayyib are both quite instrumental in the Egyptian coup of 2013. And Black Viper is asking whether the Ikhwan could have maybe won them over. And I suspect that Gum'a is probably someone who would have been difficult to win over. But Tayyib, there are stories which I am less familiar with. People like Muhammad Amasha have written about this in greater detail in unpublished work, and hopefully we'll see it published before long. But in the case of Tayyib, he had a very sort of serious animosity towards the Ikhwan because of the way in which the Ikhwan had behaved towards him in the past. So the Ikhwan youth in the Azhar, for example, had, in his view, caused trouble, and I think it's not an unreasonable interpretation of how they behaved, and so that, in a sense, is reflected in sort of Tayyib's attitudes. But my interpretation is Tayyib is not beyond reason, and part of the reason I say that is because when the Rabaa massacre took place, he did not support it, and because Gum'a supported it and very actively supported it, I think Gum'a is beyond reason. His hatred for the Ikhwan would be too deep, and his absolute unflinching commitment to the Egyptian military would have been sort of overbearing, overwhelming. Hope that answers that question, inshallah. I think Ziriyab Jamal, your very interesting comments we had dealt with. I hope that they were dealt with to your satisfaction. There's an interesting question on revolution. We'll maybe have a look at this. But let me read out sort of the question of... There are a couple of long questions, but someone was asking who's Ahmed Kuru. This is a while back, Muhammad Saad. I hope I've not lost you at this point, but Ahmed Kuru is the author of a book called Islam and Authoritarianism, if I recall the title correctly. I think it's published in 2016, published with Cambridge University Press, and he argues something along the lines, I just read sections, a chunk of the introduction. He argues that Islamic scholarly sort of norms and the kind of paradigms that were developed by the ulama in Islamic history were instrumental to the perpetuation of deadening civil society and private enterprise is the argument of Ahmed Kuru. Of Timur Quran, and the two of them, I think, are deeply influenced. Ahmed Kuru is a much younger scholar than Timur Quran, but is deeply influenced by, I think, Timur Quran. I don't know if he was a direct student of his, and that was the argument of Ahmed Kuru in that book. So you can have a read of the book. I still have to finish reading it, unfortunately, so I can't comment much further than that. So one of the sort of bigger questions that came up, I'm going to read now on Facebook, from Brother Ismail Sayyid. And he's asking on another note, probably unrelated. Okay, this might be a comment rather than a question, which is fine. Probably unrelated, and that is the Muslim Brotherhood is becoming a slur and a pejorative term aimed at anyone trying to get and narrate objective perspectives of various organizations and movements. This is stopping many even from divulging studies into the nuances for fear of being labeled MB sympathizers, despite not having anything to do with the MB. Isn't it high time for academics through peer-reviewed process, e.g. journal publications and research, to set the record straight? That's an interesting perspective. I mean, I do agree that, things like Muslim Brotherhood now, especially in parts of the Middle East, it's become a slur. But the Muslim Brotherhood, I think, has become a slur in the in Western popular imagination for a number of reasons. But one of them is that they mix religion and politics. So I don't think that that's necessarily a case of, I have a perspective on this. So you can, if you're interested in my perspective, for whatever it's worth, I've given a presentation at Gresham College called "What is a Religion?" Rethinking Islam and Secularism, I think, or Rethinking Religion and Secularism. I think it was originally Islam and Secularism, but the title on YouTube is a bit different. I mean, in my view, secularism is a religion, because in a decolonial vein, I'm thinking, well, why do we have to adopt the definition of religion that is developed in the West after the 17th century? We have the concept of deen, so why don't we start saying that the concept of deen, indigenous to the Islamic tradition, can be sort of reread as religion, and that influences the understanding of the term religion in the West, and then we engage in analysis on the basis of that, and then suddenly secularism is religion. That's one of my arguments. And basically, sorry, Brother Ismail, I'm just answering one of the questions from someone. It's all right. I mean, like, I hope that the viewers have not been too sort of but I mean, they've stuck with us. Jazakumullah khairan. So,
may Allah reward you guys. Hey, listen, I don't know if this is that Pegasus thing that UAE has going on, or what's happening here. But look, okay, so no, that's okay. No,
do you mind if I just finish off my response to Brother Ismail, because he was just asking about sort of Muslim Brotherhood is becoming this sort of dirty word. People being afraid of being labeled Muslim Brotherhood sympathizers, and that's why they don't even talk about them or write about them, etc.
Yeah.
And I was just saying that actually it goes a bit deeper than just that becoming a slur. It's the Muslim Brotherhood is a slur because it is a direct sort of challenge to this notion of secularism, that religion and politics should be separate. And that's my kind of argument.
Yeah.
The reason why secular-minded people would, to bring it back to something that you were saying, would be sympathetic to the projects of people like Abdullah ibn Bayya, is because secularism, as some scholars have pointed out, isn't necessarily the separation of religion and state; it's the subordination of religion to the state.
Yeah.
And because Abdullah ibn Bayya is perfectly well, placed like that. I mean, this is where the comparisons between him and Khaladawi are so sort of like off. Because Khaladawi, yes, he's working within the Qatari state, and this is the kind of the point that I'm making, that yet he has a kind of a degree of independence, and some of his ideas, like his advocacy for democracy, is potentially a threat to Qatar as well, right? It's not a democracy, and he has on occasion criticized Qatar as well. He doesn't think of Qatar, for example, as an ideal that should be replicated elsewhere. He writes of ideals as being reflected in the Islamic tradition. And there you have various other sort of like ideals that he speaks about explicitly. If they're taken seriously, then Qatar is under sort of like question marks as well. So that's what I'm saying.
So, So again, I want to get back to my frustration about, I just feel like between the dichotomy of the Abdullah bin Bayya side, let's say represented by, I'll just say the type of thinking that is reflected in that book that I'm telling you about, that I was telling you about his work on the nation state, or for that matter in because that's kind of expressed in many other places, between that on that side, and then on the other side, the Ikhwan / Islamist model, I do not see in either of those a lot of creative thinking to really challenge the nation state. And when I say the nation state, I mean by definition it's secular. In other words, I don't see either one of them as really
You
being.
need to read a lot more in Islamist writing, basically, because basically,
I don't want to. I don't mean to. I don't mean to toot my own horn or anything, but
sure, sure.
I have decades of experience with
Then
Islamists
you need to
personally
reflect on
and
those
in
Islamist
my work.
writings because I think,
No,
yeah,
like, what would you say about Maududi? Would you say that Maududi or Sayyid Qutb really challenged the nation state? Is that what
yeah.
you
Actually, academics
said?
now are writing about how Maududi's sort of like reconceptual. I mean, I'm saying academics are writing, and I just published an article on this, so like I'm not trying to toot my own horn as well, but that was part of a special issue of a journal of the Royal Asiatic Society, where a number of academics came together and basically were reflecting on the way in which, Maududi represents this a creative reimagining of, as a direct challenge to the nation state of the notion of sovereignty, right? So, like, sovereignty is something which comes out of, the European experience in a certain guise that's connected to the nation state, and then eventually to the popular will and those sorts of things. And yeah, I mean, people like Maududi, when Uwaima Anjum or others sort of describe Maududi as, I mean, I may be misattributing, so if it's not Uwaima Anjum, please forgive me. But, calling him like, in many respects, a creative genius. When people like, I think the challenge that we face is that because his fortunes have been tied to a specific organization, right? And that organization's rise and fall, or wins and losses, are kind of current affairs discourse. It's not really high level intellectualism, and he himself was not successful in cultivating intellectuals. He because of that, we don't often see these sorts of things. But scholars are now going back to his writings. And so, my colleague at King's College, Humaira Iqtidar, for example, is one of these scholars working on this, and she's basically saying, look, we can actually use Maududi to reimagine sort of Western political theory, Western political philosophy, and that's the reality, I think, of someone like Maududi, even though he's writing, yeah.
Yeah, and I want to.
Oh dear, we've lost you again. La hawla wa la quwwata illa billah. Okay, so in the meantime, I'm going to actually sort of come back to Ismail Sayyid's question because I didn't quite finish that. So I hope that this is okay, that people are sort of jumping from theme to theme occasionally in this discussion. I just want to keep the conversation going, and people feel free to sort of like add questions, and I can see there are more questions coming in, including one from Ismail Sayyid. But I will sort of, before I address that question, hopefully address one other one. But I don't think it's a case that people are necessarily being afraid of being labelled MB sympathizers. In the UK, for example, the fear is to be labelled a Salafist or an Islamist, and those ideas are defined in think tanks that are close to the right-wing think tanks, close to the government, and close to people like Michael Gove, who's been writing about this, going back 15 years or whatever it is, and. Michael Gove has been described as the sort of chief Islamophobe of the Conservative Party, of course. And so with people like him who are very explicitly saying these are people who think their religion should affect their politics, their religion should affect their judgment on, what is a sin and what's not a sin, for example. So, that sort of thing, those are mechanisms, in my view, for secular policing, so secularism as a religion, as I articulated earlier, policing and regulating the belief system of the masses, including the most problematic of the masses in a place like Britain, and for much of the West, to be honest, which would be Muslims, because Muslims are, they don't. What's fascinating for me about Muslims, and this is something I take great pride in, is it's very difficult for them to sort of like just be repackaged as secular, because their ideas and are so deeply informed by the Quran and the Sunnah that it's difficult to take that sort of an anachronistic worldview, which is really highly Eurocentric. And my colleague Lena Salema at Oxford has written about it at length, about the Eurocentrism of secularism as an idea. But I've sort of spoken about it briefly elsewhere. So I mean. It doesn't really. It's very difficult to be a secularist in the way that Michael Gove wants you to be, and still adhere to your Islamic ideals. And so that's why I don't think it's the Muslim Brotherhood per se. The Muslim Brotherhood here is a metonym. It's kind of a signal towards people who aren't buying into secularism hook, line, and sinker, and for a certain Islamophobic contingent of the sort of Tory party and of the wider public who support these sorts of people who've been fed this kind of ideological secular ideology. That's unacceptable, and that's why but I don't think you're saying, isn't it high time for academics through peer-reviewed process of journal publications to set the record straight? That's the end of your question. And at the end of the day, this is something which affects every layer of society, right? Including academics. Academics who are writing critically of the Muslim Brotherhood because of their lack of secularism are, writing from a secular perspective. And unfortunately, the problem that we have, and this is where I'm, really exploring decolonial thought, decolonial theory in a very serious way. The problem that we have is that a lot of people are just unreflective about the fact that that's exactly what they're doing, and so there's a need to quote Dipesh Chakrabarti. There's a need to provincialize Europe, and Muslims can provincialize Europe with reference to another tradition, which is the Islamic tradition. The challenge for someone like Dipesh Chakrabarti in his book Provincializing Europe, in my estimation, is that, as he puts it, like, no one really takes seriously Indian philosophers from like 500 years ago or 1,000 years ago. Like, these people are of antiquarian interest only, whereas the Islamic tradition is something which is a living tradition. Like, I engage the ideas of, we mentioned Qadi Abu Bakr ibn al-Arabi, the founders of the four madhabs, the compilers of the 6 books of hadith. I'm talking obviously within a Sunni paradigm, but I can engage that tradition completely seriously in the modern world. And that's, I think, really the problem that secularists or secularism of a certain mold has with Muslims or Islam. Not necessarily Muslims, because there are plenty of Muslims who will sort of adapt to these sorts of circumstances, but with Islam, I think that's where we have a fundamental sort of, we buck the trend. It's like, you should be secular and you're not being secular. What's wrong with you? That's the kind of vibe, I think, which comes across. I hope that's making some sense. I'm just going to address a couple of other questions, and then I'm hoping Brother Ismail will come back. But if he doesn't, I think we had a reasonably good discussion, and I hope people will forgive the fact that we haven't been able to have something a bit more substantive, but we've gone on for quite a while. So the question from Muhammad Saad earlier was, the thing is, regimes like the UAE, okay, it's maybe more of a comment, regimes like the UAE, Assad in Syria, Egypt, use scholars not only for their PT, but also to legitimize their, I don't know what you mean by PT, presumably staying in power or something, but also to legitimize their barbaric actions. Ali Goma, etc. are some examples. I think yes, to a certain extent, although I don't think that someone like Abdullah bin Bayya has been caught sort of like actively supporting an overtly barbaric action. He's usually doing things very indirectly. So, like, calling the Muslim Brotherhood a terrorist organization is a very indirect act. Or praising the sort of rulers of the UAE while they're sort of normalizing with Israel. That's not, what's really tragic, of course, is, within a few months of that happening, then there was this vicious attack on Gaza by the IDF, or IOF, as it were, Israeli occupation forces. And he was completely silent. Like, he piped up when the UAE wanted him to pipe up about the sort of normalization process, but as soon as there was any kind of criticism to be directed towards Israel, absolute silence, deafening silence. And that's the problem with working at the behest of these kinds of regimes, unfortunately. But that's different from someone like Ali Goma, who would, not in the Israeli case but in the Egyptian case, who would be actively advocating for the murder of civilians, right? So, Bin Bayya's silence is, in my view, more tolerable. I mean, it's just slightly more tolerable than Gomaz actions. Gomaz actions are, of course, absolute direct criminality, and this is why people, as I mentioned in chapter 8, I believe, Sheikh Ahmed Raisuni, the great Moroccan scholar and jurist, says that Gomaz is a participant in the murder of these people. So, and from a Shari'i perspective, I think that would be definitely true. Okay, so Brother Ismail Sayyid has another comment kind of responding to mine. Before I get to that, I'm just checking. Black Viper says, why do you think the ulama in the 21st century are employees of the state in comparison to their historical counterparts, even the likes of Mustafa Sabri and Said Nursi, who are actually employees? So, I mean, this is complicated, and it's about the rise of modernity, and Brother Ismail actually alluded to a lot of those, transformational changes that took place and the nature of what the state was. I mean, in some respects, some ulama were employees of the state in the pre-modern era, but the state has grown exponentially. Before it was basically just, what someone like Robert Nozick would call a night watchman state, a state that only guarded the walls and guarded the borders and paved roads, and that's about it. But aside from that, everyone would be left to their own devices. Now, the state has grown exponentially in the modern period, and a combination of economic factors, ideological factors have all contributed to this. And in that sort of setting, it's the awqaf, which would have given a lot of ulama a considerable amount of independence. I think, what's her name? Afaf Lutfi Sayyid. I've not read her book, but I read this in a footnote in Eugene Rogan's book, The Arabs, a History. Mentioned something like 20% of Egypt's land was awqaf for the Azhar in the beginning of the 19th century, I think, or something like that. With 20% of the land of any country, like, that is wealth of an extraordinary level. And so the ulama would have had a remarkable degree of independence. But, you can read, I don't know the full implications of that, but if you read the writings of people like Ahmad al-Shamsi, his rediscovering the Islamic classics, there are all sorts of reasons for kind of the disintegration of the ulama classes in what Ahmad al-Shamsi calls the post-classical period. It's complicated. This is complicated history, and I think Muslims need to spend a lot more time reading about this. At the same time, people like Mustafa Sabri and being an employee of the state wasn't necessarily problematic. Plenty of ulama had systematized exactly how that can take place. To a certain extent, Andrew March talks about this in his Caliphate of Man in chapter 2, I think. But Sami Ayyub, I think, has done perhaps the most important work on this recently, about the way in which the ulama saw themselves as deeply integral to the state, but they weren't simply sort of like lapdogs, so to speak. To use a bit of a slightly colourful phrase. And so I think it's important to recognise those sorts of kind of I don't know if it's appropriate to describe it as grand historical transformations as well. Okay, so I'm just going to read Ismail Sayyid's sort of like response to me, my earlier comment, if that's all right. Not only that, Usaama, as much as they criticized Sheikh al-Khaladawi, or the West's neocon establishment branded him as an extremist scholar, yet his fiqh, Islamic juristic opinions have been cited by prominent lawyers at US Supreme Court, UK High Courts. I wasn't aware of the US Supreme Court, but Qaradawi's views are cited. South African Supreme Courts dealing with cross-border UK Middle East Islamic transactional disputes, and even Qaradawi was cited in India's Supreme Court judgment hearing in the notorious controversial Babri Mosque Ayodhya case. I'm saying actually the rest of your comment doesn't seem to have come through. Okay, so in any case, I think that's fine. I'm not sort of I think it's important to just bear in mind, yes, people like Sheikh Qaradawi are very significant thinkers, but they're not very impactful in Western contexts naturally, because I mean, for a host of reasons, and it's worth reflecting on that. At the same time, I personally think Qaradawi is, an important and very creative and original thinker in the modern period, who is worth reading, as are very many scholars in our own time. I would encourage people to do that and get sort of, a variety of perspectives on these sorts of questions. Okay, so there are a few sort of more open-ended questions. So I'm going to, I think we've at this point probably lost hope of being able to have brother Ismail back, unfortunately. Oh, actually, no, he's saying, I just haven't been checking his particular sort of message. So I'm just going to try and see if it's possible for him to come back, because he just messaged me. No, this is an older message, unfortunately. So, okay, so I don't think we have the likelihood of having him back, unfortunately. And so I'm going to just answer a few of these questions. And next time we'll plan better, and he'll hopefully have sort of more reliable hardware. Bi-idhnillahi ta'ala. So someone by the title Orient Express is asking, the Quran says Allah does not change the state of the people until they change what is in themselves. I cite that twice in this book of mine because it's interpreted in very, very, very different ways by two scholars, Khaladawi and Hamza Yusuf. Given what Allah says, shouldn't we prioritize inner spiritual reform rather than protest? So that's the that's the thing. I mean, like these sorts of verses. Okay, and Orient Express then says, rather than protesting problematic governments to change what societies are and people aren't changing themselves. So this is what, this is, I think, a really interesting question. I don't explore it in this systematic fashion in this book. I just lay out two perspectives. So the first perspective is Hamza Yusuf, although Qaradawi mentions it before him, temporarily speaking. So Hamza Yusuf, if I recall correctly, says in around August, September, October of 2011, he, in an interview with al-Arabiya Turki al-Dakhil, who's now the ambassador of Saudi Arabia to the United Arab Emirates, says that, إِنَّ اللَّهَ لَا يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِقَوْمٍ حَتَّى يُغَيِّرُ مَا بِأَنفُسِهِم. People need to focus on their anfus, and they need to do tarbiyat al-anfus and focus on tazkiyat al-nafs and those sorts of things. And then Allah will change society for the better, right? And the thing is, so that's one reading of the text. I mean, I haven't actually gone back to the tafsir literature, but I suspect that reading is there as well. But Qaradawi doesn't deny that reading. He's not saying that people shouldn't reform themselves, but he says that actually the protests and the removal, the carrying out of Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar is exemplifying that changing of themselves. He says in his famous khutbah, I think a week after the success of the Egyptian revolution, and I quote this in my text, I can't remember the exact page, but he says, the people changed themselves and therefore Allah changed their society or changed their condition. And I mean, this is also a perfectly reasonable reading of, that sort of a surah or that sort of a verse. And what I'd say is that, I think Qaradawi is like an extremely learned scholar, and his interpretation of that verse in that sort of context is a perfectly sort of reasonable interpretation, and one certainly I think is far more compelling as an understanding of how to behave in this sort of context than what Hamza Yusuf is advocating, which is to say that actually, all of this evil that you see yourself, see around yourself, don't use that as an excuse to sort of say that, oh, that means I need to engage in Amr bil Ma'ruf and Nahy anil Munkar. Rather, you should see that as an opportunity to turn inwards. Assalamu alaikum, brother. It's nice to see you back, mashallah. Okay.
Assalamu alaikum.
Wa alaikum salam wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. I actually have been engaging people's questions, and I don't know how much longer we should be going on, but people have asked a lot of questions, and just I was thinking about engaging them to a certain extent.
Let's check them out. Yeah, I had just had to ride my bike back from the
cafe.
my house.
Right.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't know what happened to my laptop. It totally melted down. I'm on my wife's.
Right. No, that's not a problem, inshallah. It's khairan, inshallah. So I was just telling them, apologizing for, not the best sort of like setup, but inshallah, I mean, we can have future opportunities as well. Bi'idhnillah. But it was interesting. I was just taking someone by the name of Orient Express was asking about the ayah, Inna Allah la yughayyiru ma biqawmin hatta yughayyiru ma bi anfusihim. And I was just reflecting on how radically different the interpretations were in the case of Hamza Yusuf for that verse and Yusuf Khaladawi. So Hamza Yusuf, of course, is saying that, well, if you see society has gone wrong, you have to turn towards your own nafs and correct its flaws. And effectively what he's saying is, don't look at society, that's not your concern. Your concern is your nafs. And Allah promises you, if you do islah of your nafs, then society will reform anyway. And Qaradawi is, of course, saying, actually, part of the reason these revolutions took place and you were able to get rid of that dictator was because the community had engaged in islah of itself. He says that, Inna Allah la yughayyiru الناس غيروا أنفسهم فغير الله أحوالهم, or something like this. I can't remember the exact phrase. I'm struggling to actually find the precise instance where this is mentioned in the text. So yeah, I was just saying that I thought Qaradawi's reading of this, well, Qaradawi isn't denying that you should also focus on yourself and do islah of that. That's part of the verse.
Very famous for that.
Sorry?
So the Ikhwan are very famous actually for tarbiyah and.
Sure. Sorry, I just realized your echo cancellation is on. Oh, okay. You don't have headphones, I assume.
I can get them. Yeah, I have them here. Yeah, let me get them.
If you get them, then the sound quality is just a lot better. If you'll forgive that. So the Ikhwan are well known for their tarbiyah, I suppose. I mean, but yeah, I mean, for me, it's like, wait, why can't you have both, right? Why can't you, as well as doing amr bil ma'ruf and nahy an... Sorry, I'll switch your settings so that you can, inshallah, be heard more clearly.
Yeah.
Why can't you have both? Why can't that verse be understood in various ways, right? Why are you denying that sort of like practical component otherwise? Yeah, in society.
I mean, look, I'm not. We're not here to listen to what I think about that. But I think, look, you have hadith, for example, that when cheating becomes common in the marketplace, then Allah will put a tyrant over you, and so there are things in Allah's sunnah, that we just have to have, let's say, like a sort of.
But that's a hadith which isn't saying that if that tyrant is put over you, that you have to do nothing but get rid of cheating. That's the only thing that you have to focus on, right?
Yeah.
Say that. Yeah.
No, that's true. But see, there's another way to to sort of borrow the language of, the 7 habits of highly effective people or whatever.
Right.
We have to have a sort of a. And many people have expressed this sort of insight, which is that you have to have a difference between, or know the distinction between what is in your sphere of influence and what is in your sphere of concern.
Sure.
So you have things that concern you, but then there are things that you can do things about, and and there's the famous prayer of the Alcoholics Anonymous, which is like, more or less, God grant me the wisdom to know the difference between these two things.
Right.
And so there's a sense in which, when we try to, if we try to do things that are beyond our capability, which Allah, when we say capability, we know that Allah puts a sort of. I know that I cannot jump on top of my house. I know that if Allah gives me the ability to do that, and He can give me the ability to do that, I'll be able to do that. But in the normal course of the way things work, that I can't do.
Yeah.
So if we're in a state, the way to make sense of this, sort of like contrasting senses of the the ayah, if we're in a state where our sphere of concern is greater than our sphere of influence, then we have focus on what's on our sphere of influence, and we wait till such time when, if/when it becomes within the sphere of what is reasonably possible. And if we were to look at for example the situation of I don't know, like let's say the Rafah party in Turkey, you know what I mean? Right. And you say, all right, well, you guys back in whatever the early 90s, you know what I'm saying? Yes. It's not in your capability to do X, Y, Z, and then but they did what they went through the asbab. They took the asbab and they
did what they could,
and they did what they could, and then eventually they
they got imprisoned and stuff.
They got right, but they eventually succeeded.
No, they got there, but then there was a postmodern coup, as they say, right?
Yes, so, but eventually they still got there. I mean,
that was a breakaway from the Rafah Party. I mean, this is it's kind of controversial, I think, because the Rafah Party was not pleased with that, right?
Sure, but the general, the general group, you know what I mean? The general tendencies. Anyway, the point is that if you can't do anything, and the other thing is this, right? The other thing is if you neglect what is in the nafs, and you only try to fix what is, let's say, like outward, it's never going to be correct, You're never going to have because
absolutely. Well, actually, I mean, there's a hadith explicitly about this. Inna Allah la yansuru hada ad-din bir-rajul al-fajr, right?
Yeah,
I mean, that can happen as well.
That's true.
Yeah, so we can't. I mean, this is a hadith in Sahih al-Bukhari, and it's about a man who really sort of he's engaged in jihad, and he's really sort of wreaking havoc in the enemy, and then at some point he's wounded, and then the Prophet actually foretold this to one of the companions. And he was wounded, and then he basically put himself out of his own misery. And, that's, of course, a major sin, and he would go into purgatory for that, so to speak. But the Prophet ﷺ said, Inna Allah la yansuru hada ad-din bir-rajul al-fajr. That God can actually champion this religion even through a sinful man. And you think of people like Hajjaj ibn Yusuf and all the tyranny that he did. But in some respects, some scholars have, argued that actually he was quite instrumental to the consolidation of
the
Khilafah, so to speak. So
he absolutely was. But there's a difference between there. See, what we're talking about is, I mean, look, we don't want to. We're not going to get anywhere if the population of the Muslims as a whole is far away from their deen. Then what difference does it make if we have a totally
this is really interesting.
Justice,
if I can make a brief comment about this, I mean, I learned this from an article by Jonathan Brown. I can't remember what the topic of it was actually, but he kind of a throwaway footnote where he says, actually, Al-Izz ibn Abd al-Salam, one of the great scholars of the 6th century, Hijri century, Shaykh al-Islam really, but he basically says in one of his fatawa, ألا ترى أن العامة لا تصلي لكن تصوم في رمضان يعني وإذا and if they don't you see that the average person, they don't pray like the 5 salawat, but they will really be shocked if someone doesn't fast in Ramadan. And this is true to our day actually.
Today,
And then he says, and they will drink alcohol and يأتون الأدبار or something like this. نسأل الله السلامة والعافية. They engage in sort of pederasty and those sorts of illicit behaviors. And the thing is that I personally, again, someone needs to do the anecdotal, the empirical research on this. I'm going by anecdote, but based on anecdote of reading the secondary literature on this, I really get the impression that we live in a time of remarkable religious efflorescence since the 1970s. Like the degree to which Muslim communities are committed to their deen. I mean, it really is remarkable. The level of literacy that we have is unprecedented, obviously, because of
But that's not the same thing.
No, it's not the same thing. But what I'm trying to tell you is, alongside that has facilitated the possibility of something which was never possible in Islamic history, which is, having mass Islam and people have commitment. Like in early Islam, the Muslims were a tiny sliver of the society when they conquered these, the conquered territories. They were the elite. a lot of people, yes, desired to be like them, and they gradually, vast areas eventually came to Islam through conversion as well. But to have, but the average person in the Bawadi, I mean, they made excuses for them for a very different, deliberate reason in the books of Aqidah, that إلا أن يكون حديث عهد بالإسلام أو يعيش في بادية بعيدة عن أمصار المسلمين, that they could actually still be considered Muslim even if they rejected something which is معلوم من الدين بالضرورة. But in our time, people have access to that knowledge, and very often, so many people, I just love it when I see people with such devotion and commitment in our time. And I think that, subhanAllah, I mean, it's really beautiful to see that sort of, that level. Yeah.
Well, there's, of course, there are people who are, I mean, I'm probably, I mean, like I'm far from, where I want to be, where I have been at certain high points in my life. I'm far from many of the people that
Aren't we all,
that I see around us, and that sort of thing. But I just want to I want to reflect on one thing that occurred to me while I was in solitary confinement, and I had been, let's say, like, I became Muslim in '92. At that time, I was like an activist, like leftist activist or whatever, and then I kind of, just continued with like activism. I joined CARE in World Assembly Muslim Youth in '93, CARE in '94, and then it went from there. And the thing is, I was sitting like maybe like 10 years later or 15 years later in solitary confinement, and it's just me, it's just me and so I have no activism, I have no project, all I had was the Quran, and I had alhamdulillah, I had studied, and I had so it's not like a black and white thing, but I now am just face to face with nothing but myself, like I'm like and I'm with the Quran, and I have to ask myself, like, okay, like, what is it that why am I Muslim? Why am I Muslim? And what, and I'm finally I read the ayah about what is it? Allah's فارق بالحب والنوى, and then فارق الإصباح, and that ayah, subhanallah, like that really is what like kind of like broke me down, because it was like how beautiful that is. Like, you think about the seed, and Allah is the splitter of the seed, and then the same language, fadiq wal isbah, like a cosmic phenomenon. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's the same, and it's the same pattern. It's the same pattern, and yet it's on a scale. And subhanAllah, this made me reflect, and this is not like a logical argument and kalam argument or something. It's just it affected me that, like, and it made me realize that, like, this, like, ultimately, like, what is Islam as a deen trying to do? It is trying to get you into a relationship with your Creator,
Right.
And so so that's the project. That's the thing, is to see, is ultimately to be happy and see Allah's face, and to be and only it's only iman where we're happy. You know what I mean? Like, that's real happiness is from iman. And so if you have a society, like, if you think of like where the Prophet did da'wah, and he called people to tawheed, and he did these things, and then, like, it's like the famous hadith with Aisha said, if the Prophet had ordered us to quit drinking alcohol, maybe we wouldn't have, but then, like, since he did it after we got to a certain stage, then the alcohol was flowing in the streets when the people dumped it out. You know what I mean?
Right.
So we don't want to, on the one hand, romanticize it, like, oh well, first of all, we know that the Muslims were not like some angelic people running around,
Sure.
and we also know that and we know that even the Sahaba, many of them drank and were obviously committed sins, and one of them even.
This is before it was sort of obviously, but afterwards, I would have. I imagine that the reports are relatively limited of that happening on a wide scale. Right?
Well, sure, but I guess what I mean to say is that, like, so.
But there is a beautiful hadith. Yeah. I mean, you'll be familiar with of the Sahabi. I forget his actual name, but he was nicknamed Himar. because he was a joker, and he basically, drank compulsively. It seems he might have been like addicted. And he was punished for it. And at certain points, there's a report from Ibn Hajar, I think, where it says, some report that he was punished 50 times or more.
Right.
And still, the Prophet ﷺ, when one of the companions said something like, "Akhzak Allah" or something, "Nas'Allah salam al afiyah," may God humiliate you. The Prophet forbade him from doing that because this man loved God and His Messenger. Right. After 50 times or more committing this, really bad sin, he still loves God and His Messenger. So certainly being sinful and those sorts of things being perfectly compatible may Allah protect us there.
Yeah, but if you look at, so this is what I want to say is that, like, I think that we have we run into a big problem where Islam becomes a sort of loses that, you know what I mean? And like, because many people, I'm just going to be honest, like I found in the well, all right, let me put it this way. I found in, like, this, for example, the Salafi type community, they seem to have lost the sense of spirituality, if that's the right word here, whatever the right word is I'm looking for. You know what I mean? Because they spent so much time quibbling with one another about who was off the minhaj and stuff like that. You know what I mean? And then with Ikhwan, subhanAllah, I also found something lacking, because I found with them so much was devoted to the project of whatever, like the activism at the time or whatever, you know what I mean, it was. And it seemed to me like I used to reflect, this is before 9/11, I was reflecting like, subhanAllah, all this stuff that we're doing, I mean, we're burning a lot of energy in stuff that we were doing at CARE. And I was like, all it's going to take is one incident, and we're going to lose everything there, because we haven't built up goodwill. We haven't, you know what I mean? All we're doing is bludgeoning people into, like, we didn't use the term Islamophobia at the time, but it was like, but we're not like going out there and showing how the Muslims are good people, you know?
Yeah. If you don't mind me saying so, I mean, I think, you have a very personal story, obviously, behind all this, and we all do. Sorry, I'm just adjusting my wires. We all have, highly personal stories, but I think that, I can understand where you're coming from. I just, I don't sympathize with your conclusions for the most part. Right.
And then you look at, for example, I was going to quote Maududi, but I couldn't. Unfortunately, I'm not on my laptop. But he's got this book. And this is not a unique thing. I mean, this is the same type of language is found in Sayyid Qutb and throughout Maududi's work. But he's got some this book on jihad, and he's saying Islam is a revolutionary party, which is and its aim is to bring about justice in the world, and on and so on and so on. And it's actually just like it's like the same type of rhetoric that you would have read in I don't know.
But if you go and look at the sort of language that Samach Hamza uses at certain points in his sort of career, he's using the language of the people. He's using the language, a conceptual language that makes sense. This is well studied in academic literature, incidentally, that Maududi was using this language in the heyday of revolutions.
Exactly. Yes.
And he was demonstrating that he was cutting edge. Like when Hamza Yusuf in the 90s is quoting Steve Covey like you did today, or and talking about spheres of influence and spheres of concern, people can then sort of anachronistically look back 60 years from now and say, Hamza Yusuf was just so unaware of the sort of nation state and so unaware of the way in which he just imbued all the values of these people. No, I mean, I think you need to read a lot more deeply than that. Yes, and that particular text, and that tiny text that you're referring to, which is a booklet, which really, I mean, it reads very out of character to me from Maududi's main writings, and it seems like a kind of an activist pamphlet, but he's got a 500-page on jihad, 500-page book. That's where
and I used to study his tafsir and so on. But there's some weird. But there's some weird. Honestly, look,
everyone's got weird ideas in their tafsir works. Like there's no mufassir who's come out sort of like with something that everyone's going to agree with, right?
No, but it's weird. And let me say, when I say weird, I mean that's not I mean it's there's so much of the writing that I find in these, I mean, look, I even talking about people like I mean, look, if you go and find like Shariati and go find what's his name, Khalil Shiqaqi of Palestinian Islamic Jihad and his, his works, and so I mean, you read all there's a common thread among all of them, which is almost a sort of mirroring of the thought. It's not simply vocabulary. You know what I'm saying?
Right.
It's vocabulary that has symbolic and symbols. Reflect a kind of they reflect a mindset. And there's a mindset which I find in the Islamist thought. Which does indeed reflect the political program of modernity, and whether you mentioned that that people is the Muslim Brotherhood sort of the Muslim Brotherhood is considered to be a threat because it is a direct threat to modernity or secularism, but I don't know if it really is. I definitely there are people that's
hilarious. That's a hilarious thing to say, because especially from someone who's kind of spending time, thinking about how to be charitable in your interpretation of Hamza Yusuf or Abdullah bin Bayya. I mean, like if you read
but
chapter 4 of my book in particular,
my same complaint is about the Sheikh Abdullah's work. You know what I'm saying?
Not just Sheikh Abdullah. I mean, like as I go through fairly extensively, Hamza Yusuf's kind of engagement with the idea of, I can't recall the exact word that he uses, but this idea of, being in a state of weakness is actually a great advantage for, for the Muslims. It might be the end of political Islam, but it's the beginning of spiritual Islam. This is something he says in the Prayer of the Oppressed. It's basically in chapter 4, and I mean, like that sort of. I'm not.
Page
105.
I'm not committed to any. I'm not committed to any particular people as being like the answer.
I'm not committed to any particular person
that.
either. I mean, this is, I guess, this is why I find some of these conversations a little unusual in the sense. I mean, like maybe it's my fault for sort of like homing in on this particular point, because like I'm just saying that when it comes to the commitment to secular modernity, so to speak, the notion that, as he puts it, most of the Muslim world is now experiencing a state of powerlessness. This is page 105 of my book. And therein lies a great opportunity. The loss of state power, military might, sovereignty, and control is not the end of Islam, but a new beginning. It may be the end of political Islam, but it surely portends the resurgence of spiritual Islam. Like that sort of attitude, until Muslims learn and internalize the sunnah of powerlessness, we will not be worthy of assuming the responsibility which comes with power. And for God to give it to us before we are ready and prepared would be an abandonment of his providence for this community. Now, that is great ideology for any secular sort of like project. That's what you need to teach all the Muslims. Look, you need to embrace powerlessness. You need to recognize that spiritual Islam is what you are after, not political Islam. Political Islam is the disaster. Okay. And that's the sort of tragedy, I think, of, in my view, of like the thought of
well,
Sheikh
I like
Hamza.
I mean, look, I have to,
because like these other people aren't saying, like these Islamists aren't saying reject your spirituality, at least not the sort of leading lights. No one, like I suspect I've not read Mawdudi's spiritual writings, to be honest. I'm better read in Khaladawi than I am in Mawdudi, but all of these people do highlight the importance. I mean, one of Mawdudi's colleagues.
There's not much, to be honest with you. I mean, there's not much, at least not what I was, not what I studied, and I studied.
Sure, but I mean, then you can say, oh well, Fakhruddin al-Razi, he's written next to nothing in Tasawwuf. So I mean, like it depends on people have different.
Fakhruddin al-Razi is one of the greatest.
Well, no, I mean there are plenty. My point is that there are plenty of great ulama who you can cite from the past who aren't necessarily writing about tasawwuf specifically, right? I mean, people have areas of specialization.
If tasawwuf, if tasawwuf means, I mean, for example, I was just reading something he was writing about the soul and why the he was doing the tafsir of وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي Adam, and he said because the soul is from the alam al-ulya, and it is the only thing in the alam al-sufla, which is the which is from the Alam al-Ulya. So therefore, this is why it was, you know what I mean? So this is
that sort of metaphysics is kind of more, that's on brand for Razi, right? He's a metaphysician.
Yeah, but it's beautiful too. It touches the heart and it makes you understand.
I mean, like if you I don't know if you know Urdu.
No.
But okay, so I mean, Maududi is considered one of the most elegant. I mean, I'm not an expert in Urdu, so my Urdu is not good enough to appreciate excellent style.
Right.
But people who have brilliant Urdu, they basically say, look, Maududi is one of the best stylists in the Urdu language. Like, for me, what's a bit sort of unusual is, why is there this kind of like, and this is the kind of plea I make in the end of my book, why is there this real effort is exerted to try and marginalize certain people from our heritage and say that actually no, they've got things so horribly wrong, we need to exclude them from the mainstream of our religious discourses, discussions. I think people like Maududi, people like Khaladawi, like no one's perfect. We've all got errors, right? And so, but they can also be sort of people who can be engaged thoughtfully, creatively. I cite Hamza Yusuf stuff in my classes and my teaching, like when I'm teaching in a more of a seminary setting. In an academic setting, most of the time I'm not thinking theologically, so to speak. I'm just sort of historically. But I Sheikh Hamza is one of the scholars who deeply influenced me from, like, of all of these scholars, he's probably the one I was exposed to at the earliest age, right? And so, that's something I have a great deal of love for Sheikh Hamza's work. I disagree with his politics, but I also have a great deal of love for, Sheikh Khaladawi's work. I mean, he's a very multifaceted figure. I visited Sheikh bin Bayya's house twice. I can understand if I'm not going to be invited anymore because I've written about him in a somewhat critical way, or quite critical way. But, I have a great deal of love for all of these scholars, right? The only person in this book who I have no love for is Ali Gomar, and I think that's quite reasonable, right?
Well, sure, yeah. I mean,
for me, the question is, look, I'm very curious in a sense, like, what is the problem with Islamists? What is the problem with certain people who didn't spend a great deal of time cultivating their, tasawwuf, or cultivating their expertise in hadith, or everyone's got a role, and this is what this is what Sheikh Dado says as well. Sheikh Muhammad Hassan Dado has influenced me a lot as well.
Yeah, I mean, just for example, to go back to your writing on the contrasting and comparing Qaradawi and bin Bayya. I mean, for example, some of the ideas that he's discussing, which are well within the realm of classical Ikhwan thought. So, for example, the comparison of, okay, you've got a parliament, and that's like parallel or analogous to the shura, and so the shura is right. You know what I mean? But in reality, is there not what we're doing here?
We're grafting.
Taking like essentially taking things that are contemporary innovations that are not neutral, you know what I mean, that have their own content and that are and it's not a matter of, for example, we're just going to use Persian methods of administration or something like that, because in those periods you had a
I mean, this is exactly what, of course, Abdullah bin Bayya and Aziz are doing right now by working with the UAE. I mean, it's no different. But
exactly. Yeah. No, but see, now you're getting it.
But you see? I am getting it. And I've always, like, this is a discussion we went into extensively in the last session as well. And we were talking about, what's the genetic sort of like root of something like this, and why is this a problem, but that's not a problem, etc. No, I understand. You have this, but as we discussed in that session, sort of this anxiety of, a kind of originalist anxiety, like, is this pure, or a purist anxiety? Is this genuinely Islamic, right? Wait, this is not how Shura was understood, in earlier history. And we just have very different sort of like conceptions of what is Islam on these sorts of points. Because what I'm saying is actually, and this is something I have to articulate more systematically, and I need to really think through exactly what I think about these sorts of things as well. And I'd love to hear and indeed read in the longer term your own sort of reflections on this. But what is Islam? That's really the big question, isn't it? I mean, like, on what basis can Qaradawi is calling democracy Islamic.
Right.
Bin Bayya, without explicitly saying so, is calling autocracy Islamic. Like Middle Eastern autocracy in the present day is Islamic, right? It's Islamically legitimate.
Right. He's saying that the form he explicitly says that the form that it has taken is not of itself counter to Islam. Where I would say, based on what I think, not because I'm more Islamically knowledgeable than the Sheikh, but simply because of my understanding and my in-depth reading of what the state is and what modernity is, I would say that it's absolutely inimical to not only Islam but also not coincidentally humanity. You know what I mean?
But what's interesting is that you're and perhaps I'm misreading you, but you seem to articulate your antipathy towards sort of the Islamist take on this a lot more than you do towards Bin Bayya's take on this, for example.
No, I'm
maybe okay. So you would say that both
of them are antithetical. I would say that both of them. When I read, I take your point. You say that this is not reflective of all of Maududi's writing. I would say that the line that I mentioned is actually quite similar to, as I mentioned, the writing of, in different ways, of course, but of Shariati I mean, all the way up to, and I mentioned Fathi Shiqaqi and all these different Islamist writers. There's a common thread between among all of them, which is a kind of it's a kind of populist. I don't know, maybe even populist is not the right word, but there is that distinction in the Islamists between like the sort of more Leninist vanguard Jabha, you know what I mean, which is the direct translation from.
I mean, the thing is, I mean, this is why I always just find it fascinating. It's like you're saying, oh, it's a direct translation. They weren't hiding that these were direct translations. They're not embarrassed about that, right?
All right, I know, but like, so like resist, then this language of resistance and so on, which is all very, very. The milieu that they were part of, which was where communism had.
And this is the conversation we had last time. Sorry, your sound is going a bit.
I don't know what is happening. Okay. The technology is.
Nahmadullah ala kulli hal. I mean, this is a discussion that we had also a bit of last time, which was that, can Muslims, develop their own sort of like new understandings of things, right? And or do they need to, whatever was developed at a certain point in historical tradition in certain very highly contingent circumstances?
Yes, exactly. I agree with you. Yeah, I agree with you. So we can't. It's silly to say we have to break out Mawardi and just replicate this. You know what I mean? Or
I mean, like Mawardi was probably like almost certainly like a radical transformation. I mean, we know it was a radical transformation to the Khilafah al-Rashidin.
Exactly.
Like we didn't have to wait till Mawardi, of course. Ali radiallahu anhu's shift to Muawiyah is a radical break.
To Muawiyah,
right?
yeah.
Right.
Or for that matter, in what did Ibn Khaldun discusses? He says he's got a really interesting section where he says some people think that the ulama should be part of the ruling councils.
Right.
He says, but they're not, and they shouldn't be. He says because these people who are ulama, they know nothing about siyasa, they know nothing about administration, and so he says like. He says it's true that during the time of the Khulafa Rashidun they were, and that Umar used to bring them in and so on and so on. Yeah. But he said that's not appropriate now in this time. So and of course he shouldn't be understood as that's not secular. He's not talking about secular.
No, of course not.
Right, because
that's such an anachronism. Obviously,
it's an anachronism.
Yeah.
What I want to say, I want to say in conclusion, there are people, I don't know if we've got anyone left listening to us.
We actually have the largest number of people attending since we began.
Oh, wow, 15, that's amazing.
15 attendees at the moment, which
may Allah bless every single one of you.
May Allah bless you all.
So
we've been between 10 and 15 for the whole session, so it's very kind of people to join.
That's awesome, you guys. Yeah. So to me, it's like, I would present the problem this way. I would say, okay, if you want to know why I think the political Islam is not really the right answer. I'm not saying it's not like the worst thing. It's not. They're not like terrorists, blah blah by definition. No. That's not what I'm saying. I'm not like agreeing with like the statements coming out of Forum for Promoting Peace or any of these kind of people. No,
sure. I
feel like that the worst thing about it is that it's it's the thing that presents itself. It's the people's best. It's the best. One of the best efforts that has come out to try to say, how do we as Muslims grapple with our current reality?
Sorry.
And
what? What is the? Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Political meaning Islamism, Maududi, and those
right,
things.
right, exactly.
Yeah.
It's like it was an attempt, like
it was an attempt.
An attempt. You know what I mean?
Yeah,
and the bad thing about it that I would say is that it's a missing of the mark, and that it continues to like represent for many people like the only alternative to secularism. And on the other hand, my disappointment with Sheikh Abdullah, who to me would have because of his encyclopedic knowledge, would have represented of Maqasid al-Fiqh. I mean, the man is just magnificent. I would have loved for him to have had a better grip on why what he's saying is so deeply mistaken about.
I think he knows what he's doing. I think he's a very intelligent man.
Well, regardless, it's unfortunately he's missing the mark. Okay.
So I agree with that entirely.
So what are we left with? We're left with trying to find. We need ulama where are these ulama? To me, it's not Qaradawi and it's not bin Bayy. I want to know. I'm disappointed. I'm frustrated. I want to know where are these ulama.
You should read more Qaradawi, but his stuff is a bit old now. But yeah.
All right. Well, anyway, I've read. I just want to know, and it's not. By the way, and it's not Salafism. It's not the Ikhwan. Right. I'm sorry. It's not Madkhalis. Obviously, it's not. You know what I mean? It's not any of that. It's not these clowns. I'm sorry, these these clowns in Egypt, the Noor party, who are just like just to say their name makes you laugh. You know what I mean? Not that Noor is funny, but the image of these guys, is so preposterous. And then you know what I mean? And then so where are the where do I go? Do I just go up to a mountain and with my sheep and just hope that something better comes around?
So I mean,
and my family, and just withdraw.
These are all really important and interesting questions, and I'm really conscious of how much of your time I've taken, and the fact that we haven't answered a fair few audience questions. I mean, while you had disconnected, I took a lot of that time to answer some audience questions. So.
Are there any things left that we can answer that anyone has asked?
There are questions directed at you, actually. So there's a question which has come relatively recently, which is what about the question of Palestine? Can you ask Ismail Royer? I mean, you can ask him directly, of course. So to explain why Sheikh Hamza Yusuf and Sheikh bin Bayyah's association with the UAE, how they've helped.
I doubt it's helped at all. I don't think it's helped at all.
I think that's definitely not
helped. Yeah, it's definitely not helped. I mean, I think if you want to, I mean, the issue of Palestine and is to me, it's insoluble by almost anything that's on the table right now, and certainly not this whole so-called Abraham Accords is a
sure, it's a travesty as well.
It's a travesty. It's a comedy. I mean, it would be a comedy. It would be a comedy if there weren't,
Another chap has. I mean, you were talking about Maududi and sort of missing spirituality, and that's incidentally a critique that is also. Obviously Hassan al-Banna is more complex figure in that regard.
Yeah, and, they have a point. That person has a point there.
Yeah, so sure. Hassan al-Banna, of course, I mean, like says in his Mudhakkirat, Da'wa Da'iyah.
That, and I know, by the way, I was with many the usras and so on that the Ikhwan have, and I know that they have, certainly study groups that study that and study other. Go ahead,
yeah. So someone else has an interesting question, which is, I mean, I can answer this one, but you could probably as well since you've read the book. Did Hassan al-Banna call for rebellion against governments?
Well, I don't know. I don't know any of his writings.
I mentioned this in chapter 9 of the book, so I mean it's pretty late in the book. He explicitly does not. He very explicitly says, no, this is not something that Muslims should do in the context of Egypt that they're dealing with.
Yeah.
And so, like, there's an interesting. No, actually, I think I might have cited it in earlier chapter, but basically, there's a really interesting article by what's his name? He's an Israeli Uriah Shavit, an Israeli academic of Islamic studies. Uriah Shavit has an article on the Muslim Brotherhood's doctrine of rebellion and obedience.
Interesting.
And basically, this is also mentioned by Michael Cook. So Uriah Shavit deals with some of this, but Michael Cook has this line where he says, maybe surprisingly for some, Hassan al-Banna was very explicitly against the idea of rebellion against the ruler. And the thing is, as you will have read, Yusuf Khaladawi's position, that's very on brand for the Ikhwan in general.
Not only Ikhwan, it's also what for what classical ulama.
So Uriah Shavit basically says the Ikhwan are basically mainstream Sunni in their perspectives on this.
Right. Yeah.
And this is why I just find the entire sort of discourse of, some of the people who are basically arguing, the classical tradition legitimates the coup. Like it's so outlandish to me for people to make that sort of an argument. I mean, a lot of respected scholars, people I respect, have argued that way, but I hope I have politely disabused people of that. I hope.
I would really advise. I have a couple points on that. Like one is if you read Ibn Khaldun on his discussion of rebels, rebels, and then also I have on my blog, which is agoodtree.net, agoodtree.net. I have an article where I translate several classical Maliki positions on from Ibn Rushd to the grandson and the grandfather. And then and then others on how to deal with what they wrote about dealing with rebels who are on the one hand have an ideology, have a point of view that there are an ideology, I guess is the best, that's an anachronistic term. And then those who are just sort of Bughat or something,
Is it possible? I mean, if it's possible, could you maybe share that link and
yes.
I will sort of.
I'll
post it as a comment, and it should go out to Facebook
but I'll give it to you right now. But certainly, as we said last time, it seems like your description of Khaladawi's discussion of the conditions of rebellion and stuff are just mainstream. Really very mainstream. Yeah.
Nothing out of the ordinary, and that's where it's kind of ironic that there was so much invoking of doctrines of obedience in that context, considering what people like Khaladawi and other ulama were saying. But the thing is, a couple of things. One is Ibn Khaldun, like Michael Cook quotes him, and I quote possibly in a footnote, that the problem of the ulama wasn't that they weren't, they were quietists, that they were usually rebelling where it wasn't really justified. It wasn't, you should only rebel in contexts where you can actually do something about it.
Right, exactly.
And they weren't doing that. They were being precipitate.
Could I quickly point out? I just sent you the link to that, but I wanted to point out something really interesting, which is the discourse today on those who on the issue of rebelling against leaders and so on, and those like the ulama who are against it today. It's interesting that in the 90s and so on, and continues to be for some circles, the issue is actually whether it is kufr or not. You know what I'm saying? To support or not support. So for example, when I was in prison with Richard Reed, the so-called shoe bomber from Al Qaeda, he and I had endless debates about whether or not the government of Pakistan were disbelievers, and whether or not to doubt that the government of Pakistan are disbelievers is itself disbelief, because doubting whether kufr is itself kufr, and so on. Unless you have an excuse, and what's an acceptable excuse, and is there an acceptable excuse? So for some people, the issue of whether or not the rulers should be rebelled against is a matter of aqeedah.
I mean, it's a tough one. I've just written a book about Hakimiyya, an article about Hakimiyya.
Yeah, you told me, and I want to see that. But did you notice that that is actually not part of the discussion now? I mean, in many circles. It was at one time that was the discussion. Now it's more like, what is the principle that is being violated? It's a principle of what? Of you're not, in other words, what is outrageous? I know I'm not doubting that it's outrageous, but what is outrageous about supporting, opposing the revolutions and stuff? What is it that's outrageous about that? What is the principle that's being violated? For some it would have been it's the Hakimiyya principle, right? But here it's not. Can you tell me?
I don't think anyone was. Qardaawi doesn't argue in those sorts of terms. I mean,
exactly.
Exactly. I mean, but the thing is, that question that you're asking, I've not really sensed it as an urgent question of the revolutionaries, right?
That's what's so interesting to me. I mean, right? Because if this is about if the issue here is Islam, then why isn't this really critical? And even in classical, but this isn't like an invention of the of Takfiris or something. I mean, this is actually like something
sure, it's a classical doctrine. I mean, it's just articulate. One of the points that I make in my article is that, look, these ideas are latent in the tradition. They're not articulated using one term in this way. It's an idea which is quite obvious, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala creates our norms, right?
Yeah.
But the thing is, I'm a little sort of like, I'm surprised that you think that should be a central discussion for those who are engaged in revolution.
No,
the jihadis might have done that at one point in time in the 90s or beyond, before that.
Yeah.
But it's not, Khaladawi doesn't raise that as an issue. I mean, it's fascinating, isn't it? Yeah.
It is really interesting. I mean, I'm not really I don't think it's a good idea for Muslim awam
to invoke it in that way.
Right. To start talking about who's a kafir and who's not a kafir, because they don't. But I mean that obviously went down a very dangerous road, and there's a certain group of people for whom that was an obsessive topic, and they became ISIS essentially, and Al Qaeda.
Right.
And for that matter, jihad and takfir al-hijra and all these other things.
Ironically, of course, the state behaves in similar ways, right?
Yes, of course.
The state,
absolutely.
And this is, I'm kind of translating Qaradawi's book ظاهرة الغلو في التكفير, because the mainstream of the Ikhwan, of course, rejected that kind of the Qutbist turn, so to speak.
That's right.
And I mean, one of the points I make in the critical introduction of that text, which please do, though I've been sort of, I really need to sort of finish off the review and so on, but the post-review kind of version of the text. But one of the points I make is, look, takfir has its analog for the nation state as well, right? And laws of apostasy have their analog in the nation state as well. Here it's called killing terrorists, right? I mean, drone warfare has killed more people probably than sort of judicial apostasy laws in all of Islamic history, right? Because it was quite rarely applied, from what I can understand.
I saw your comments on that, but I don't know. That it's a really interesting subject. I mean, obviously, drone warfare is a horrible development. You know what I mean? But at the same time, like, there are people who, you know what I mean, who I'm not sad are dead. You know what I mean? Like, I'm not sad that I'm glad. And as a matter of, like, I remember like a Shiite guy I was in prison with from Hezbollah. He asked me. He said he was like, when I first came to where he was, his unit. He says, "What's your thoughts on Zarqawi?" And I'm like, I said he's a lunatic, and I'm glad he's dead. And
but that's all well and good in the sense, Zarqawi was a lunatic, and that's very well established. Nas'alullah salam al afiyah. But at the same time, he's just one example of a project which is, thousands and thousands of people have been killed, the vast majority of whom, as far as the leaks tell us, are innocent, right?
Right.
So
exactly.
That's what I was trying to highlight, that all of this being up in arms about a medieval sort of like hukum, which exists to them largely symbolic, as far as I'm concerned, the idea of ridda. But that is used to sort of condemn this tradition and so on. While at the same time, all of those practices are being perpetrated on a scale which is epic compared to what would have been practiced in the Islamic tradition.
Yeah.
And suddenly, that's all fine. It's covered over, and it's kind of like it's. It's disappeared.
But you know what? But here's the thing, though. We can understand, for example, like to me, it's somewhat similar to the Mongols. Like the Mongols come and they just like if there's any slight resistance, they just slaughter everyone. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so we kind of understand mass slaughter. But it's another thing when someone is like invoking Islam to say you disagree with my group, and therefore you're a disbeliever, and therefore you're going to be killed. And there are people out there who are doing that.
What's really intriguing, of course, is this is something that Goma has condemned for decades at this point. Yeah. And then literally he does that, right?
Yeah.
In that, like his phrase is "هذا كافر," and he's referring to Qaradawi, as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah.
And then he's quickly, as though he's catching himself, almost, كافر بنعمة الله.
Oh, okay, yeah, he cleaned it up.
He's Okay, so he's trying to wriggle out of it, right?
No, but this is just silly. This is silliness. Yeah. Look for example, but even in another interesting example of that is like the Medkhali phenomenon, where so for example, I had a friend who went to Medina and studied in Medina. Before he went to Medina and he came back. He had just converted. He went to Medina and he came back as a hardcore Medkhali. And this was like in the 90s. Yeah, and he. But at the time, Rabi al-Madkhali had been arrested for criticizing the Saudi government for not cracking down harder on those who criticize the Saudi government. So they arrested him. Him. So when the brother came back, and by the way, this is a known brother, so I don't want to. If I could mention his name. But anyway, when he came back and I said, he looks at me and he looks me up and down. I said, "Assalamu alaikum, brother. How are you doing? I'm glad you're back from Medina." And he looks at me and says, "What happened to your beard?" That was his response to me. So I wasn't going to say anything, but when he did that, I said, "All right, well, let me get you back." So I said, "Hey, I heard you're hanging out with like a rebel against the Saudi government. You're studying for." And his head almost.
Yeah, that's enough. Yeah. Sorry, your sound's gone. Your sound's gone for a moment. I don't know. There we go. Okay, it's back. It's back.
So these Medkhalis, they actually.
Your sound's gone again.
If you're not sufficiently pro-Saudi government, then you're actually almost a disbeliever.
So that's really interesting. I mean, how this happens in various sort of like different points in Islamic history that you disagree with me.
Yeah.
And there's this doctrine of وَمَنْ لَمْ يُكَفِّرْ فَهُوَ كَافِرٌ, right?
Exactly.
And you have this, even at the time of I forget the Mufti of Tunisia or something like that, during the invasion of Algeria or something by the French, and he's like, هذا يجب الهجرة من هذا أصبح دار الكفر or something like this. This is now Dar al-Harb and you have to do hijrah from it. Yeah. And anyone who denies this is a kafir. And then in the sort of following years, his own sort of land was then occupied by the French. And then رد عليه the same fatwa applied to him, right?
Applies to him,
So those sorts of, that sort of irrational exuberance, so to speak, in fatwa giving is not, of course, alien to our tradition. The problem with groups like ISIS and Al-Qaeda in our own time is, in my estimation, and you're, of course, far more learned on these sorts of points than I am, a consequence or a function of the fact that Islamic legal authority has been decimated. So,
yes,
we don't have meaningful structures.
Exactly.
But Islamic political authority also has been decimated. Like, we don't have Islamic political authority. We just have illegitimate political authority from an Islamic perspective. And so in the absence of that, it's a...
free-for-all.
It's a free-for-all. These people, unfortunately, are symptomatic of some fundamental issues that we have as a community. And we can treat the symptoms, but until you think about that root cause, and, we're going to really struggle. And Muslims in the West constantly suffer from this. But, we're having first world problems in some respects. Of course, I'm not suggesting that your own sort of suffering in this regard was a first world problem, but in places like Pakistan, people are being killed on an epic scale, whether by drones or by Taliban or any of these groups, right? So,
well, you mentioned something interesting.
Really
you mentioned something interesting at the beginning, where you said that you cited a book or something where someone non-Muslim is saying the abolition of the caliphate a 100-year-old mistake. Look at
The Economist. They had an article.
The Economist. There are scholars, non-Muslim scholars, for example, like Ephraim Nimni, I would suggest one, and others who have been who is Israeli, who are calling for some return to a dhimmi type system, because essentially they're calling it the technical term that they use is non-territorial autonomy. Right. So the concept of non-territorial autonomy, like many people tout as one of the great achievements of modernity, this sort of hegemony of one unified legal system, for example. You know what I mean? Which is it's not the case that for example, that a non-Muslim could murder and then just get away with it by saying in my deen murder is just fine. No, but at the same time, like there was a delegation of autonomy.
Legal pluralism existed just so widespread.
Right,
and this is destroyed by the modern nation state. I mean, it's
destroyed by the. It is but to a great extent.
Western states, that's true, and a lot of countries, post-colonial countries, there are actually hybrid sort of like legal pluralism does exist, but in certain parts of the world.
Yeah, and only to the extent that they continue to retain some of the
and only to the extent that the state permits it now.
Permits it exactly. Right.
Yeah. So it's like it's also I mean.
Go ahead.
I
was going to say. No. I mean, I was going to say that there's a really interesting book which I very much disagree with its conclusions, but it's about there are several books about this, but like a recent one that came out that was maybe I'll send you the link to it, but it was discussing the way that the need for funding wars. And plus the development of new technologies and so on is really what led to the destruction of legal pluralism so it's not an ideological thing. It's not like someone just said, oh, you know what, we no longer want to treat Jews differently. We no longer want to allow Jews to have their own thing. We allow Armenians to have their own thing. It's not that some enlightenment happened. It's that the technological need to tax everyone and to extract as much as they could from everyone drove these ideas.
This is what is quite challenging in when we're dealing with modernity, and this is why I mean, as much as I like the tenor of someone like Wael Hallaq's work, The Impossible State, and so on. Yeah. There are global historical changes afoot for the last 500 years, right?
Yeah.
And this is where I understand. I mean, I once summarized my dissertation to someone. I don't know if I have this in writing or it was something I said verbally, but I said that my doctoral dissertation, which is unrelated to my book, is basically a study of Islamist engagements with secularism, liberalism, democracy. Secularism, democracy, and liberalism in that order. Yeah. And my summary is that Islamists represent, actually I think I say this in the conclusion, the most sophisticated engagement from an Islamic perspective with these ideas, and they're woefully inadequate.
Yeah, I agree. Well, that's probably true. Yeah. That's probably I could agree with.
Yeah, and so in a sense, I mean, the thing is, we have a long journey ahead of us. But for me, it's like, well, the Islamists had a good niyyah. They're doing the right sort of reflection. But there are global historical, transformations afoot, and have been for hundreds of years.
Yeah.
And as far as I'm concerned, Islam's going to look radically different in this era than it was historically, right? So we can take inspiration, but we need to, one of the things that where we disagree somewhat is that, all these changes are inevitably, detrimental to Islam. And my perspective is that actually Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has created, He's in control. Allahu ghalibun ala amrihi walakinna akthar an-nas la ya'lamun. He is ultimately the creator and the fashioner of our condition right now, and he expects us to be Muslim in these moments as well.
Right.
And our being Muslim in these moments, as it says, وَدِدْتُ لَوْ رَأَيْتُ إِخْوَانِي, and the Sahaba said, no, أَلَسْنَا إِخْوَانَكَ? قالوا, no, these are people who come later, and they believe in me without seeing me, and for them لِأَحَدِهِمْ أَجْرُ خَمْسِينَ مِنْكُمْ.
Yeah.
Now, I genuinely believe that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala gives us the opportunity to be as devout, as committed to the deen in every age. The Sahaba's time was a special time, and I'm a Sunni and a card-carrying Sunni, and I believe that. But in every age, we have that opportunity, and this is هذا ما أدت إليه اجتهاداتنا. Khaladawi, and even bin Bayya, I grant him that he's making ijtihad. I think his ijtihadat are way off the mark, but I actually think Khaladawi's ijtihadat are, not in the same way off the mark. I mean, and this is where we disagree basically. I actually think there's something to it. I should, just quickly an aside, because someone's been asking a question repeatedly.
Okay, sure. Yeah.
The book is Frank Vogel's Islamic Law and Legal System, and the subtitle has Saudi Arabia in it. Published 1993, I believe, and I've shared a link. Okay, yeah. I hope that makes some sense in terms of like.
Yeah. No, I
and that's a legitimate point of disagreement, of course. For us to see things differently.
By the way, could I point out that I still think that you're not on the mark in seeing Sheikh Abdullah bin Bayah as being so drastically different from Qaradawi. And here's not just Qaradawi, but the Islamist project. And even though his endorsement of these current regimes is off, I'm going to tell you why. Because look, Sheikh bin Bayah really actually does have a lot of Ikhwan roots, a lot of Islamist roots. A lot of people don't know that. I mean, he has actually, not just with the International Union of Scholars or whatever, but I mean also look, someone sent me a. I don't even know who it was. It was some weird Saudi account on Twitter or something. But when I tweeted something about Sheikh Abdullah's writing or what he was doing or something like that, and they sent me a screenshot, or they sent me a photograph of Abdullah bin Bayah hugging Salman al-Auda and saying, look.
But that's completely different. I mean, that's well known. He's a student. He was on Salman al-Auda's doctoral committee. Salman al-Auda treats him as one of his greatest sort of like teachers and so on. And that's why it's so tragic that he hasn't said anything, even though he's a few miles away from him in jail, right?
Yeah. But see, the thing is that Sheikh Abdullah had, it was let's say like for me, I actually tend to think that this is one of the reasons why his thinking has not escaped a lot of the same, a lot of the same kind of paradigms that I'm unhappy with the Ikhwan for not escaping. Let me ask you this question: what do you think about that notion of, or what does not you, but what does the Ikhwan, or what does Qaradawi and their thinkers say about the notion of ulama being involved in things like, for example, a council of like the Iranian style, like council that reviews legislation to determine whether or not it's So you see what I'm saying? This is kind of.
I mean, you can ask me that question because it's something I've thought about as well. I mean, Qaradawi, I think would probably agree largely with that sort of idea, but there would be caveats, and that would be, I mean. I have to go and see exactly what he says, because in the writing of a lot of these Islamists, it seems to be presupposed. They'll say that people can choose their rulers, and they have the right to sort of make the laws as long as those laws do not transgress Sharia. That clause suggests that there's some kind of overview, right?
Yeah.
There's some kind of, there's judicial review, basically.
Like in Pakistan, they have something somewhat similar.
Yeah, but the thing is, my argument here, of course, is that, well, judicial review exists in a lot of systems, right? And so for me, it's like, well, secularism is a religion. In a place like the United States, they say there's a separation of religion and state. From an Islamic perspective, well, the Constitution is kind of like the sacred document of the state. And you have ulama of the Constitution, and they preside over a council and make sure that the laws that are voted in by the sort of populace have to be in conformity with the laws of that sacred document. So for me, it's like, why is that any different?
Not. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
You know what I'm saying? I mean, that's sort of the point, which is like.
But the ulama always had oversight, or at the very least, they had the right to express their opposition to the laws that were being promulgated as siyasa. So if it conflicted with Sharia or fiqh, well, fiqh is, I guess Sharia and fiqh have slightly different meanings in the modern period.
But the siyasa would be things like I don't know. I mean, like the siyasa would be things like ta'zir for certain things, or
but
it might
even
be
there,
like,
if you go and look at the books of ta'zir, they say, okay, what are the limits of ta'zir? You can't do such and such. It cannot reach a had punishment in some of the madhahib, not in all of them, unfortunately. There are limits that the ulama spell out in the texts, which might, occasionally, of course, be ignored by those in power, considering the circumstances. But it creates a normative sort of like structure which is difficult to completely ignore. That's how normative systems work, of course.
Yeah, but they could give but but again, we get back to the thing of like, does it necessarily have to be that way that it was at one point? You know what I mean? Like,
that's the thing. I mean, this is what and we're agreeing on this. Basically, that look, the problem you and I both have actually is the centralization of the state, and to a certain extent, I share Halak's sort of like anxiety about this. But at the same time, what's really fascinating, of course, is that it's all the traditionalists who have come aboard with that, right? So
but that's where they're wrong. That's what. That's Taqiyuddin.
Muhammad Bakhit al-Muti'i in Egypt, who
yeah.
was I think he was the Mufti or the Sheikh al-Azhar, I can't remember which.
Taqiyuddin Uthmani is another one who I'm disappointed in. You know what I mean? Because I would have loved to have seen from him something more sophisticated. Like if you look at
it's very superficial. His book on Islam and politics.
It is.
I was quite disappointed.
And I have a signed copy of it. But if you look at the Deobandi ulama after England, after Great Britain took over, and colonized India, they came out with a really interesting document on how they're advising the Muslims to deal with this situation, which was such a break from, and likewise, like when Spain, Ferdinand and these guys, Isabella took over Spain, which in Spain was kind of a proto nation state in many ways. Now, the real nation states wouldn't come until England, but I mean, like like a proto nation, and the way that the ulama discussed how the Muslims are to deal with that situation. Those to me were like really interesting. Ways of and I almost think that rather
you should do a doctorate and write a book on this.
Right.
Those are understudied in my knowledge.
They are because these are people who with a classical mindset, a pre-modern mindset, were attempting to deal with the situation, and so maybe by studying them we can access a way of thinking that is not encumbered by paradigms,
Well, I mean, the thing is, everyone's encumbered by paradigms, as far as I'm concerned. This is the point that I'm kind of sort of.
Yeah, but there are good paradigms. There are
better paradigms, and
there are better paradigms.
So I mean, just thinking about the secondary literature, because I've not spent a great deal of time in Iberia, but I think one Sharisi's one of the scholars who is about contemporaneous with those crises, and I think some of his work has been explored, possibly by David Powers, and then. There must be, again, South Asia is one of those blind spots in my research, unfortunately. But the founding of Deoband and the resistance of the British and the Sepoy Mutiny and so on, those sorts of things are definitely worth exploring, I think, more systematically. From a fiqh perspective, actually.
Yeah, for sure. Yeah.
I'm very conscious of the time, especially your time, because I suspect that it's coming close to Maghrib time there, or some. Well, I don't know.
Almost.
I mean,
almost. Okay.
Yeah. Sure. So I might. However, stick around a little to maybe answer a couple of the questions. I mean, if you need to get going, I don't want to keep you. But
about 5 minutes, inshallah. About 5 minutes. I'm surprised that people are so interested. I mean, but to you, listen to you, but I mean to me, I'm not trying to have a false modesty, but
no, barakallah fikum, jazakallah khairan.
Are there any other questions that might seem relevant?
You can see if you're on a computer, you should be able to see on the panel where you click comments, there will be questions. So there's still 11 people here, but I'll just sort of I'm just thinking this. There's a brother who's or sister who by the name Orient Express who has a lot of.
I'll find that for you. Yeah. They have an interesting document which is on my computer, but they've.
So which one are you talking about? Which question are you talking about?
It's the one from the Orient Express.
He's got several questions, so he's asking.
Oh, what did the classical Deobandi scholars say? Essentially, they gave guidelines for the Muslims on how to deal with non-Muslims and how to deal with the rulers. But their guidance for dealing with the non-Muslims was like essentially to be virtuous towards them, have adab, and be neighborly, but yet don't mix with them so that you would lose your religion. And then so that's the horizontal, and then they had like a vertical advice, and so I'll find that for you, inshallah. But it's a famous document. I just can't remember the name of it off the top of my head.
I mean, there are lots and lots of questions, so I'm not going to sort of. I mean, someone's saying here, I didn't watch. So this is Adam Smith.
Yeah.
I assume it's not the great.
Not the Adam.
Okay. I didn't watch the whole stream, but what does Brother Ismail think about the Afghanis who are traditionally from a tasawwufi background? In terms of both spirituality and Islamism,
I don't know about. Yeah, that is a good question. I do have some experience with Afghanistan and was in fact indicted for attempting.
Of course.
But I want to pivot a little bit from the question because I can't answer it. But on Afghanistan, for example.
So your sound is.
Oh.
I don't know what's going on.
Is it?
Yeah, that's better. That's better.
Okay.
For some reason.
Okay.
Yeah.
Like I would not call the Taliban, for example, Islamists. For example, I would say that they're and I realize I'm not answering this person's question, but it just sparked a thought in my mind.
Right.
I have always thought that the solution, which is not the best word, but the remedy, would not come from a massive uprising, popular type of thing, nor would it come from like a Leninist vanguard, but rather would be like an invasion. So, like for example, by Muslims. So for example, I was like looking at Syria, and I was like, part of me was like, wow, maybe Turkey invades and, you know what I mean, and then solves the Assad problem, and but yet gives them some. This is what I was thinking back in back, I don't know.
Okay, a long time ago.
A long time ago. Not now. But you know what I mean, and then like or like with the Taliban, it was almost like I remember asking a question of a sheikh in like '99 or something, saying something like, isn't this kind of similar to the Ottomans, where you had like a tribe coming in from like the the steppe or something, and then like just taking over, and isn't it, as opposed to an Islamic revolution, you know what I mean? So, or any kind of which to me is problematic because it imports notions that are not, which in my mind are not necessarily authentic.
I mean, presumably you're opposed to the Abbasid revolution.
Well, no, I don't think that actually, and there's no such there was no revolution before the French Revolution. You know what I mean?
Okay,
even the American,
in that sort of sense.
Yeah, even the American Revolution was not a revolution because revolution at that point meant a return to something. You know what I mean? Whereas a revolution after the French Revolution changed its but meaning,
that's such a funny way of looking at things as far as I'm concerned, because like we talk about all sorts of like revolutions historically, and I think what's his face. He's just written a book about this. I cite it right at the beginning of mine, actually.
Well, most rebellions and so on were in the past, insurrections and so on were led by tribal leaders, religious leaders, and so on. They weren't like they weren't led by like a sort of mass uprising.
I mean, the thing is, if you think about the Mongol invasion and the Genghis sort of like ideological, like. They thought Genghis Khan was basically a godlike figure, and I'm thinking about Said Amir Arjuman's Revolution, Structure and Meaning in World History. It's published 2019. He kind of does this global history of notions of revolution in various stages, and he basically maps out. It's an interesting sociological history of the, very long durée of history, and looking at what were important revolutions. And he actually lists the Arab revolutions right at the end of it. But I can understand that. Yes, there is a kind of like qualitative shift after the French Revolution. There's something that takes place in Europe, but those sorts of I can't claim to know the history very well.
I want to recommend a lot of readings for you on that, because there was a very qualitative difference between the sort of rebellions.
But you're basically saying ever since then the French Revolution has poisoned everything. Right?
Yes, that's exactly what I'm saying.
And I have greater sort of like faith in I have a greater sort of sense that God gives Muslims in all ages the opportunity to think about how to be Muslims.
Of course, agree with that. Of course, I agree with that.
And so,
by the
even
way,
if
these guys, this Orient Express has got a lot of really interesting questions.
Yes,
like Badia's Zaman Said Nursi's stance of rebellion against Ataturk is really good. A lot of people don't know. I actually spent Ramadan in '94 with Fethullah Gulen in Turkey.
Oh my goodness!
With him personally.
Before he was persona non grata. Okay.
No, he was. Then he was kind of persona non grata with the seculars.
Yeah.
And subhanallah, I remember asking him. Well, not him, but one of his sort of higher ups. We were walking through Istanbul, and we saw these flyers for Rafah. And this is '94, before Rafah took over, won the elections. And I said, "What do you guys think about these guys?" And he said, "Oh, we like them." He said, "They're not like us. They're not us, but we like them." You know what I mean? So I thought that was really interesting. But like they consider themselves, they consider themselves the heirs of
Badi'a Zaman.
And so that was my first time ever hearing about him. So I actually learned a lot about his life and his resistance or survival. They used to actually, I don't even know how much of this was accurate, but they used to talk about how he actually lived in tree houses, a network of tree houses for a while to avoid Ataturk. And his That's actually a really good point. His document, there's a khutbah that he did in, I believe, in Damascus. On it's in Arabic and it's floating around, but it's something very similar to the document that I'm talking about from the Deobandis. That Sayyid Nursi did, and I got that on my computer too. Anything that we mention here, anything that we mention here,
it's also possible. Sorry, your sound's gone again, unfortunately. Yeah, it's okay. Still, it's not gone. I think there's a problem in the headset. You can take it off if you like. I'll just switch off your I'll edit your mic session so there's echo cancellation. Yeah.
There's no end to our technological problems.
Nahmadullah ala kulli hal. No, it's all good. And so, Jazakumullah khair for 3 hours of your time. It's really been fantastic.
Oh, likewise.
And what you can do, of course, this goes live on YouTube. It's being broadcast right now. Okay. And for the benefit of people who would like some of these links, we'll try and sort of include them,
yes.
In the sort of chat and so on, in the comments. Bi'idhnillah.
Absolutely. Yeah.
I really need to thank you for all the time that you've given us. And really, I hope, we're supposed to discuss this book and we covered a lot of very important themes in it.
Yes.
And I think it was, all the richer for, going beyond the book, because people who are interested in the book, please buy and read it. Or just please wait for the sort of like PDF version to be accessible through Oxford University, Oxford Scholarship Online. But inshallah, Jazakumullah khairan, Brother Ismail.
Yeah.
It's been an epic 3 hour session. This is the longest session I've ever had with anyone on my channel. I really appreciate your time, and
likewise. Yeah, I think we've been able to get a lot more understanding of one another's points of view, and throughout this. And
I certainly feel. Alhamdulillah. From our last conversation, I felt that there was a lot of understanding and common threads and shared sort of perspectives. So, Jazakumullah khair. May Allah increase us both in knowledge and give us tawfiq to behave in a way that's pleasing to Him. Bi'idhnillahi ta'ala.
Ameen.
Jazakumullah khair for everyone who's been joining and participating so actively. And we apologize for not being able to answer just the full gamut of questions that were directed towards us. But with that, سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت لا إله إلا أنت سبحانك subhanallah, it's so late and it's actually like 10 in the evening. So سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك نشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. Inshallah, we'll see you in a couple of weeks' time. I will inshallah be inviting Madawi al-Rashid to talk about some of her writings.
All right, I'll be tuning in, inshallah.
جزاكم الله خير. في أمان الله. السلام عليكم ورحمة الله وبركاته.